Good morning, everybody. The time is 9:30 and the inquiry is resumed. Firstly, Dr. Keith, just wanted to see how you're feeling.
Yeah, I'm a bit better this morning. I've just had an update from the CCG, if that's helpful.
Yes, yeah, please jump straight in.
Yeah. So I've just had a message from Dr. Shackleton, who's the senior partner. I'm literally reading it, reading it out. Just said he's just spoken to Lucy McLeod, who says the estates team are speaking to the national planning team right now for sign off of the letter they've written, and we should expect a report within the next hour or two. So okay. Hopefully that is true. And hopefully something will materialize very shortly. So I've given them Alison Bell's email to send it to there and asked to be copied in, so then I can forward it to everyone.
Okay, thank you. That's obviously very tight in terms of timings with the appellant and their witness, but we can only deal with what we're
oh no, I mean absolutely.
It's no one's fault here, is it? It's out of all of our control. So
I'm happy, sir, if you are to just we'll just see what happens. Obviously we don't know what it's going to say. In the very unlikely, but I suppose technically possible event that it does really throw up something new and important that you need to hear evidence on, absolute nuclear option might be I need to recall a witness just to sort of talk about it, but I don't want to go, we won't go there until we absolutely have to.
Okay, but that's right, and that is an option available to us, but as you say, we'll park that unless it's necessary. Yes, okay, thank you, Dr. Keith. Conditions, I've received back council comments on my comments and also the county council comments on archaeology. Has the appellant, Dr. Keith, seen those documents?
Not sure. I will check. I will check, sir.
Let me just see the email. Yes, so Dr. Keith and Mr. Herbert were CC'd in.
Fine. In that case, the answer is yes, we got them. Yes, I've just had it confirmed.
Okay, because it's possible we'll be getting onto that today, depending on how things progress. So hopefully you can all have a look at that during lunch hour or something similar.
Yeah. Thank
you. On that, if we do get onto that this afternoon, is Mrs. James available this afternoon if we do end up holding at least part of the roundtable session? And that's a nod from Smythe. Thank you. On documents in general, I just wanted to check that I'm still up to date in terms of the ID document list I've got. So I'm just going to draw up my list and just read it out. And then if you can just shout if you think I've got anything wrong or if I'm missing anything, please. Just loading it up now. So I have, in addition to the four we'd already had agreed, which were the opening statements and Mr. Jolly's representations, I've now got the updated roundtable session agenda, which we held yesterday. I'm not sure whether it's really an ID document or not, but the draft Section 106 planning obligation. Then the application form and the decision notice for the White Crown Stables case. The Cambridgeshire County Council email Ray archaeology, which is what we just discussed. And then the Burston Nurseries Limited St Albans appeal decision.
Yes, that one, sir, I understand. I'll just check the website. I think that was added, and you can have it, it doesn't matter really, but I think it was added as a core document. And I appreciate that it was submitted during the inquiry, so you might want it as it sits either within the there's that I think it's section 5 of the CDs is where all the appeal decisions are. So you could I think it's called Doc 5.18. So we could have it there. But I don't equally, sir, if you say it's been submitted during the inquiry, I want it as an ID, then that's obviously fine.
I was going to come on to that actually, because as far as I can tell, the website doesn't have an ID list unless I'm missing it, which means I think the documents might have been added into different CD folders. So I've gone to the East Cambridgeshire website, I'm clicking the online library and there's no ID folder.
Right. maybe that's something that the council Mr. Smythe could take away.
I can see he's making a note. So yeah, so you can just take that away. Because I think I would like an ID doc list that's separate
From the CDs. No, fair enough, of course.
To come in. And just one more on my list is the suggested route for my site visit, which also thank you both for putting that together. And that all seems sensible to me, having reviewed it for my site visit. Are there any other documents that I'm missing? Okay, obviously, if you think of any at any point during the day, then just let me know. On the site visits, so I think we're in a position now when we know for certain we're finishing this week and we confirm this up. So Monday for the appeal site visit, I was going to say 10 o'clock to meet the representative. And then Wednesday, I can't do Tuesday for other reasons, but Wednesday for the example.
Yes.
We'll
send. I've been told that instructions, although there won't be very long instructions for reasons I've already explained, will be sent to the case officer, and we'll copy in the council and Dr. Keith as well, just so she can see what's being said as to how you go about doing it, or if anyone who you need to sort of make yourself known to when you get there or whatever. But we'll do that hopefully today. But yeah, I'll let them know so that you're intending to go on. It's in the next Wednesday.
Okay, and realistically, late morning will be when I arrive. If that
late morning, will do. I'll pass that on, sir. Yes, of course.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you. The only other thing that I've got on my list to cover is Mr. Wilson's statement. Mr. Simon, if you were to review that overnight.
Yes, I have indeed. I have indeed, and I have indeed offered to do that. But having said that, I think it was going to be sent to me, and I don't think it has been. I think there was oh, hello, there's Mr. Wilson. Was it sent, Mr. Wilson, via the? I know we talked about this yesterday. Was it sent to the case officer?
It was sent to Alison Bell with a request that she passed it to you.
Oh right.
If you like, I can do a brief resume. It's a 3-page.
I'd be happy. Should we just not? I don't want to hold. I've not received it, but I don't mind just doing that, sir, just to sort of press on, and I'll let you know at the end. I know this is sort of the wrong way around. If there are, in the unlikely event that there are problems on admissibility or whatever, I will say something and we can deal with it. But I don't want to hold things up. So, Mr. Wilson, if you were content to do a sort of a précis of what it says,
I've got a brief précis. It'll take me 2 or 3 minutes.
Okay, that seems like a sensible way forward. And then after that, we can hear from Mr. Harris as well, which we had programmed in this morning. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Wilson.
Good morning. I'm John Wilson. I'm Vice Chairman of Bottisham Parish Council. Thank you for letting us discuss an additional item. We were presented with new evidence last week that we'd had no chance to consider and comment upon, this being the Rangeford Village Company being the likely operators of the Bottisham scheme if the appeal is successful. We feel this is very relevant because this is the model that the inspector will visit next Wednesday. The point made in this new submission is that this is a very expensive premium scheme designed to be accessible only to wealthy older people. The initial pitch is clearly directed at relatively fit and healthy people to buy into several years before they need the actual care element, i.e. it could be spread arguably over a 5, 10 or even 15-year period. There is therefore the much vaunted statements by the appellant's witnesses that, quote, the need is acute and, quote, the need is now, are truly exaggerations. What is being promoted is future care and support means. The prime criterion will be wealth, not need, in our view. For example, in a small 2-bed apartment in their Wiltshire village that you're visiting, sir, forgetting the £430,000 capital cost, the community fee will be £708 per month. That's more than my pension. With the extra levies, the outgoings are about £17,000 a year, and that's before general living costs. The assessment of need, in our view, therefore needs to take into account the economics, and we feel that it will not meet the general need required in a balanced market, i.e. a balance between self-funding residents and those supported by public funds. Creaming off the wealthy, in our view, will make other operators less able to provide the care facilities required within the area. So we need to look at the disadvantages and risks of this if the appeal is successful. It could result in retirement village residents exhausting their resources on service charges before they actually need care. This reinforces strongly the case made by Dr. Keith, who could finish up picking up the pieces when residents can no longer afford care in the retirement village. In the parish council's view, this is not a scheme that will meet the needs of the older population, regardless of means, and it certainly does not meet the very special circumstances required to build on the Greenbelt just to satisfy an avaricious landowner. I would point out this landowner also has another site half a mile from Bottisham, which is not in the Greenbelt. I appreciate these are not material considerations in planning terms, but I felt that our concerns should be drawn, attention to our concerns should be drawn to this. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wilson.
I've got no questions arising from any of that, and so I'm glad that we did it that way.
Yeah.
So that's all fine, and we've got the evidence of Miss Venables on all of that, which you've got, Inspector. So nothing further from me on that topic.
Okay, and thank you very much, Mr. Wilson. Thank you. Okay, before I turn to Mr. Harris, is there any other preliminary matters that anyone wishes to raise?
Not from us, so thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. I think we agreed yesterday, Mr. Harris, you are willing to accept questions at the end.
Yes, indeed.
Thank you very much. Okay, well, I'll turn over to you then, Mr. Harris.
Okay, well, thank you, sir, for letting me make these points. I was surprised by contradictions between what different appellant experts have said, and even between different parts within what an individual expert has said on their own. But I shall start with an important agreement between Miss Venables and Mr. Sedgwick. It was stated by Miss Venables that in private housing with extra care, 70% of people come from within 10 miles. And Mr. Sedgwick said that he had come up with the same figure. And further, that he had found that marketing this type of accommodation was most successful when it focused on people living within 5 miles from their retirement housing with extra care. These distances travelled, and they were mentioned in Miss Venable's need assessment documents based on research done with ARCO. This makes good sense. I understand that a short distance travelled means, for example, that one can continue to see long-standing local friends and attend clubs and other regular events where long friendships may have been established. Miss Venables used estimates of demand or need based on the populations of the whole of East Cambridgeshire. She showed us a number of tables containing population figures for people of different ages for the whole district, rather than based on an area close to the proposed site in Bottisham, say within the 10 travel miles she sees as so important. Yet the proposed site in Bottisham is further than 10 miles from the vast majority of the district's population, especially considering the greater population growth at distances further than 10 miles from Bottisham, mostly to the north of the district, such as the large growth in Littleport described in various documents. This is continuing with another 1,000 homes, not 1,000 people, in Littleport up to 2030, which is set out in the planning document called Littleport Vision 2030. Littleport is 22 miles from Bottisham, travel miles from Bottisham. This is likely to mean that the proposed Bottisham site is more than 10 miles from well over 70% of the population of East Cambridgeshire on which the demand has been calculated. The demand or need has been claimed is based on the estimated proportions of the East Cambridgeshire population aged over 65 and the proportion of those living in private houses so being in the market for private housing with extra care. This fails if people want to stay within 10 miles from where they previously live, as stated by Ms Venables, supported by Mr Sedgwick, who mentioned the extra attraction of moving within 5 miles. On Friday morning, Mr Belcher described examining other possible sites in East Cambridgeshire for the development of a retirement village with private housing and extra care. He described 2 types of filter that led him to conclude that they were all unsuitable. One filter was whether the site was big enough to accommodate a village of the type proposed for the Bottisham development. The other filter was whether it could be delivered in time, which, if I remember correctly, was 3 years. However, he didn't filter for distance from the population on which the demand has been calculated. He also insisted that an acceptable site must be large enough to accommodate a retirement village with extra care of the same size and complexity as the one proposed in Bottisham. So he ignored the 10-mile and 5-mile distance evidence from Ms Venables and Mr Sedgwick. He didn't have a filter for that purpose. If they are correct about the importance of the distance from people's previous houses, there is still a way to meet much more of the demand and the need for private accommodation with extra care. This way to do it is to construct 2 or more smaller schemes much closer to the actual demand, even if they are not as large as a proposed scheme. And I don't think that the demand was based on a requirement for a village of the sort that was described. It was for the basic sort of accommodation. That's what the level of need is. With such schemes, as I suggested, 2 or more smaller schemes closer to the demand, the actual demand, those residents that previously lived nearby can continue to use the clubs and other institutions where they have long-standing friendships and maybe sporting habits and so on. But of course, such solutions would not use the land owned by the appellant, who only benefits if this greenfield site is used. With less than 3% of East Cambridgeshire being green belt, at least some of the sites that Mr Belcher rejected as unsuitable, probably all of them, are not green belt. Yet Mr Crawford claimed that the visual effects of such site, of the proposed site, is much the same as for any green belt site. That, it seems to me, is irrelevant if the alternative sites are located outside the less than 3% of the district that is green belt. So the comparison is not between alternative green belt sites, but rather between the proposed site, which is green belt, and the alternatives that are not. Also, in discussing the need to maintain the rural setting of villages close to Cambridge, Mr Crawford said that that was overridden by the acute need of this type of housing. But again, the acute need is claimed based on populations distant from Bottisham. Right, well, I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Mr Harris. Mr Simons, do you have any questions?
No, so the good news for Mr Harris, and indeed I suppose more importantly for you, is that, as you'll remember, the need evidence and the alternative sites evidence was looked at, as Mr Harris rightly says, on the basis of East Cambridgeshire, but it was also all the way through looked at also on the basis of a 10-mile market catchment, and all of that set out in excruciating detail in the proofs of evidence. So I appreciate Mr Harris's point, but happily it's something that we've looked into quite a bit. So no questions for Mr Harris, but thank you very much indeed.
May I come back on that, please?
Not really. No, it's not a. You've given your evidence.
You've used the 10-mile radius, the other area, and I think the things that apply to that. I mean, for example, it's been stretched to 14 miles to Haddenham, and also if you look at Linton, there's a retirement village with extra care just across the border outside the area, much closer to Linton than to Bottisham, which I managed to find. And it is a retirement village. And that might be the case. That's the only one I was quickly able to find. But it may be the case elsewhere beyond the borders, both of that area and the other area.
Mr. Harris, this is something I'll be looking at carefully as I review all the evidence. So I can reassure you that looking at the detail of all these issues is, utmost in my mind. And I will be looking carefully at the methodology that the appellants used and whether I agree with it or not in coming to my decision. So I can reassure you on that.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. And thank you, Mr. Harris. For both yourself and Mr. Wilson, just for my note when I put this in my letter, are you formally John or Jonathan?
John.
And I'm John too.
Okay, thank you. And I think you're a councillor too, Mr. Wilson, is that correct?
Yes, I am. I'm vice chair on Bottisham Parish Council.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you to both of you. Okay, so looking at the agenda, up next we have Mr. Snedden.
Our third John of the morning, sir. Basically. For the hat trick, it's Mr. Snedden. So I'll ask him, sir, if you're content to just press on to turn on his
yes, absolutely,
his camera, if he can. Can't currently see him on the screen. Let's just see. Oh, there we are. I think I can see him now. Good morning, Mr. Snedden. Can you see and hear me?
Yes, I can. I got a bit of a sunlight problem with this sunny morning.
I can see and hear you okay. So, and obviously you've not, Mr. Snedden is, well, he won't obviously have appeared on my list of appearances at the outset, so you've not got his qualifications, but it's Mr. John Snedden, John Snedden, SNEDDON, BSc Hons MRTPI. That's what I would have put on my list of appearances if you've been with us on day one, Mr. Snedden. And you are with Tetlow King Planning, the same firm, of course, as Mr. Warner. I wonder whether you could sort of introduce yourself, if you like, to the inspector and to the inquiry.
Yes, thank you. I would like to say I did pass on all your condolences that people expressed to Mr. Warner. He's very appreciative of those. So apologies for taking that aside from what I've been asked. I've been employed I've been at Tetlow King for 17 years. I've been employed as a professional planner for 30 plus years. I work, the vast majority of my time is working with specialist housing for the elderly operators. That has really been a lot of my time in the 17 years I've been at Tetlow King. 9 years I've been the managing director. And those are national operators and regional operators and land promoters. I've promoted such sites in local and neighbourhood plans, made appearances at examinations in public. I work with the Housing Learning Improvement Network, looking at their planning pages and updating them. And my company's an affiliate of the Associated Retirement Communities, which I will refer to as ARCO when asked. I actually contributed to the Housing and Later Life document from 2012, which has been mentioned in the appeal proceedings. I submitted and made the appeal at Sevenoaks, which is CD 5.9, and submitted the application, appeared at the hearing. I was at a hearing last year for Adlington, who specialise in urban brownfield sites. The practice was involved in the West Malling Appeal 5.6 and the core documents in Lower Shiplake, and I think I can leave it there.
Thank you very much indeed. So that's an introduction to Mr. Snedden. What we'll do, sir, is, as I understand it, Mr. Snedden, your intention is to take Mr. Warner's proof up in these slightly unusual, very unusual circumstances. Take it up as your proof, if you like, So you can be questioned about it by Mr. Smard or anyone else who wants to ask you, or Dr. Keith who wants to, or the inspector wants to ask you questions. And if and to the extent that there are any points of disagreement or difference, you're going to tell us as we go.
Absolutely, I would be. That is fine, thank you.
Okay, let's see how we get on. Right. First, then we'll get into the questions of a bit of detail, but just first, please, the overall test, the determinative test for the Inspector in National Policy, please. Your reflections on what it is and any views you've got about it.
Yeah, I think the test it is the main overarching test. I think here it is the harm versus the benefits, and I think it's set out quite clearly. It's accepting, we accept, of course, that the proposal is harmful by definition to the green belts, and then there's a relatively simple balancing of issues. You know, do the benefits outweigh the harm? And if the benefits do outweigh any harm and they reach the level of very special circumstances, then permission should be approved. And let's just
sorry, pause there. I just want to. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. I just want, as you're going through it, we were, I think, having up the text. The text is at paragraph 148, please. Paragraph 148 of the NPPF. So if you just turn that up, it's core doc. You probably got it in your own sort of format, but it's core doc 4.1 is the framework. And if you just give the instruction,
I'm looking at that.
Good, just a moment to get there. It's page 43. And it's that I think you've just been talking us through the operation of that second sentence of paragraph 148, which starts, very special circumstances will not exist unless the potential harm to the green belt by reason of inappropriateness and any other harm is clearly outweighed by other considerations. So give us your reflections on the way that this paragraph works.
As I said, it is, in planning terms, a relatively simple balancing exercise. You know, the harm versus the benefits, and we've got the harm to a degree defined, although there'll be issues about the characteristics of the development. And again, by me saying that it's simple, that does not mean that balancing is an easy or straightforward thing to do. And I think as well, benefits are not considered in isolation from each other. Mm-hmm. They're considered as a group, a basket, if you like, adding to a final view in terms of the assessment and balancing exercise, sir, that you would have to do.
Okay, so there we have it. There's the test. Do the benefits clearly outweigh the harms, etc. Let's turn on then to a bit more granular detail, some of the issues that lie between the appellant and the local authority. Now, the first thing I just wanted to ask you about, the first heading, is the location. Do you have any reflections on the location where the site is proposed?
Well, it's clearly, in my view, a sustainable location. The local plan, development plan from 2015, recognises the good range of services. The council, I believe, and the witness accepted that it was a sustainable location for this type of development in terms of its proximity to services and facilities and potential employees as well. I would say that is always part of a consideration in this type of proposal. And again, I think that's relevant to House 6, which we might come to and talk about. But there's no objection that I can see from any party in terms of the main parties, talking about the council in terms of a sustainable transport or conflict with COM7, which is the relevant local plan policy which was set out in the committee report. And again, the statement of common ground confirms that Bottisham itself has a good, at 5.7, Bottisham itself has a good range of services and facilities. Thank you.
Okay. All right. So that's as far as the sort of locational sustainability goes. Let's try and work through together what the development plan has to say about a scheme like this in a location like this. Could you take us first, please, to your views on the growth policies and the plans? Let's just pause for a moment. It's core document 4.5 is the local plan. And within 4.5, we've got policy growth 1 on page 23 and policy growth 2 on page 25. So I'll just give you a moment to assemble those.
And I'm going to quickly turn my light on because I think.
Of course, sir. Yeah. Wouldn't be able to see some of this stuff. You let me know, Mr. Snedden, when you've got those handy.
I will do. I did have the paper copy, but not the whole plan. So I will just find that. With me. Sorry, I'm being a pain. Yes, I'm there now. Very slowly.
Good. Okay, no, don't worry. So we've got growth 1 on page 23 and growth 2 on page 25. Could I have your reflections, please, on these two policies?
So they're growth 1 is a quantum type policy. It's saying the amount of development over a period of time. But again, I think the council accept themselves that there are issues with that policy in terms of the housing figures within it, and that was raised and stated in the core document 4.6, which is the local plan review document, which we could go to if required, but essentially that was from April 2020, and essentially that was saying that it wasn't up to date with the changes to the MPPF in terms of how we calculate housing needs / demand in the present day. So it is, as Mr. Warner states in his proof, it has issues, it's out of date, and there are questions and matters of degree in terms of how much that might taint the rest of the plan. Mm-hmm. But of course, Mr. Warner has set out in his proof what he considers the full weight and the relevance of the plan. So it does have an impact on growth 2, which I will discuss if you wish.
Yes, please. So let me give the inspector one reference sort of en route to growth 2, if you like. You referred, I think, just there to the local plan review April 2020. I'll just give the inspector the reference. That is core doc 4.6, which I think you may have mentioned. And there's a paragraph in there that goes to what you were just talking about. It's 3.18 in that document, 3.18, which says that there's strong evidence to suggest that the housing requirement in the local plan, 11,500 over the plan period, is in need of updating. Thus, at least in part, policy growth 1's in need of updating. ... Okay, so that's growth 1. Growth 2, then, please. What are your reflections on growth 2?
Again, a policy entitled Locational Strategy. It directs developments towards the 3 main settlements and the service and population centres in the area. But of course, what it doesn't say is completely exclude. There is a degree of permissiveness in the policy. And again, looking at the second sentence, it says more limited development will take place in villages. And then it goes through in a hierarchy about defined development envelopes. And then it carries on to talk about development outside defined development limits, explaining quite clearly that it will be strictly controlled and it has a particular test there in relation to the in relation to development outside development, that there should be no significant adverse impact on the character of the countryside.
And just pausing there, I'm going to ask you about that test in a few minutes when we get to Housing 6, because there's a similar test in Housing 6. The inspector raised this yesterday, and so I want to go into that in a little bit of detail. But let's pause that there for now on the landscape character stuff, and we'll come back to it, and continue to move, if you would, through growth 2.
Yeah, so again, it lists the exceptions, which is quite a long list, longer than many I've seen in many other policies in my experience. And of course, one of those refers to affordable housing under House 4. I'm going to say House 4 instead of HOU, because I'm not sure how to pronounce that.
Fine by me. Fine by me.
House 4. And again, the third one on page 26 talks about residential care homes, and
yes,
specifically related to House 6. So again, I've really got nothing else to say on that, unless you wish to draw me out on any particular topic. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I suppose one thing I would like just your view on to the inspector is just taking the policy sort of on its face. Is it your view that what's proposed would fall within the residential care home exception? You know, is this a residential care home?
No, I agree with Mr. Warner that it doesn't fall under that exception.
Let's look into that in a bit more detail then by turning up House 6, which is, I think, the next place for us to go. On the way, let's just pick up as on the way there, how one on page 43, if we can, just before we get to House 6. How one on page 43 of the plans for housing mix policy.
Again, I think it's interesting that this policy, because I think it's very relevant, and Mr. Warner does make reference to it, and again, this policy is a policy common to many local authorities in terms of seeking to ensure that it's supported by the NPPF, that new housing supports the population it's planning to serve. And it has various criteria about developments of 50 or more dwellings, 100 or more dwellings. But again, it never mentions the definition of specialised housing. But how could it? Because the NPPF and the PPG came later with that definition, as I understand it. So this is a policy seeking to ensure that older people and disabled people are catered for within existing developments. And one of the issues with that, sir, is that there's no measuring. There's no measuring taking place. There's no monitoring. And again, that document, the local plan review document from April 2020, which is core document 4.6, actually tells us this. It tells us that there's no monitoring of this policy in how it is serving the population and the needs of the people. That there's nothing in the AMR, the latest version, so that is a considerable failing in my regard with regards to the NPPF and the PPG and what it's doing now and what it says now in terms of explaining and measuring and then reacting to how the older people are and different population groups are being served.
Okay.
Just quickly, there are a couple of references there, Mr. Snedden. You mentioned CD 4.6. Do you have a paragraph reference that you'd like to take me to about monitoring results?
I have.
Or even just my note that I can read in my own time afterwards.
It is 3.37. And can I just read the sentence maybe for the attendees? neither the local plan nor the AMR, the annual monitoring report, set out a policy by policy set of indicators.
I see. So your point is that if we want to know exactly, if you like, how well How 1 is doing, or how well the sort of the council's doing in respect of How 1, that's not something that's specifically done in the AMR or anywhere else.
That's right, and the relevance of that. So while How 1 doesn't essentially deal with the specialist housing definitions,
No.
which are in the PTG,
Mhm.
we also don't have information about how older people are being provided with opportunities to downsize and move into adapted properties in the general C3 category.
Okay, thank you. Now, with that then behind us, let's move forward in the plan to House 6, which is on the council's approach that House 6 is the sort of key policy we need to think about, as Ms. James explained earlier on this week, last week. And we get that on page 50 of the plan. And just if you turn that up, Mr. Snedden.
Yes, I'll tell you the moment I get there.
Okay.
I'm there eventually.
Good. Okay. We've got House 6. Now we've got a policy in two halves, I think. We've got a policy that the first on page 50, we've got that there's a paragraph that starts residential care accommodation should be located within a settlement, ... Do you see? And
Yes.
then over the page, we get the language as an exception. Proposals for care or nursing homes may be acceptable on sites outside development envelopes where ... And then we get those three bullet points that the inspector's seen a few times now. So what are your reflections on this policy, what it means, what schemes are within it, without it? And then we'll turn in a moment to have a look at those three criteria.
I think this is, as Mr. Warner says in his evidence, and I quite agree, that this is heavily slanted towards care homes, residential care homes and nursing homes. It seems unarguable to me that is the case, but I'm sure people have and will argue with that point. It's intended to, if it intended to refer to this type of accommodation in the proposal, the extra care accommodation, I think it would be more explicit. So there's an issue there about difficulty in language and what it actually means. And again, I would go on and explain what my opinion about what it does mean, if you wish me to.
Yeah, please do.
So it's as I say, it is obviously referring to care homes, the very classic residential institutions. It was written sometime before 2015. Perhaps extra care wasn't as prominent as it was meant to. And again, I've seen reference to this paragraph, paragraph 4.7.3, which is specifically mentioning retirement homes and villages and extra care housing. So it's well aware of that type of development and that type of care accommodation, but the language is not transferred over into the policy. And again, I have to look at the exception, which is informative. The exception is for care or nursing homes. Care or nursing homes.
Let's go on. Sorry, Jim. Please finish off your thought.
So I think in my 4.7.3 seems to be more related to just giving some sort of musings about the elderly care sector and the direction it's moving in and where it's moving into. And it does refer to in the second last sentence, the last sentence, it's a long one. Other forms of accommodation include care or nursing homes. So it even defines it in that paragraph 4.7.3. So I think this is excluding extra care accommodation, and I'm happy to explore it further with you.
Well, let's explore it further in this way. It's a funny one because it's not. The inspector needs to consider, I think, what the implications are both for the council's case and for the appellant's case. If House 6 includes our scheme or if House 6 excludes our scheme, we need to look at it both ways, and he needs to understand, you know, how that plays out on depending on who's right. So let's just work this through first on your reading of it. Okay, so let's assume that the inspector accepts what you've just said, and he looks at the wording at the top of page 51 and care and nursing homes, and he thinks, well, that's not this. What then, if that's right, does this plan tell us about the circumstances under which private extra care might be acceptable outside settlement boundaries?
Then this policy is silent. It is silent on the delivery of extra care accommodation.
Okay, and if it's silent, you know, how does that affect the weight that we would give any conflict to it in the balance?
It means we should give very limited, if no weight to this policy.
Okay.
In fact, I would argue no weight.
Because it's silent, because that would follow.
Absolutely, and that follows through. And again, can I just add in there that in the council's proof of evidence, which is core document 10.1, there is an explanation at 2.3 where the witness lists a range of matters to take into account in considering how to enact the balance, and mentions that a policy silence is part of the things that should be considered in decision making.
Okay, so route one for the inspector of at least two, but there's route one is to follow the Mr. Snedden route, which is to say that this policy not capable of incorporating the appeal scheme, therefore this plan doesn't say anything about private extra care outside settlement boundaries, so there's a silence, and that goes to weight. That's route one. Now route two, let's give him the other view. What if the inspector goes with what Miss James had to say, which is that, as opposed to sort of that our scheme is capable, let's assume he agrees with her that our scheme is capable of falling under this language of care or nursing homes at the top of page 51. How does that play? What do we do with that if that's what his finding is?
Well, very simply, it's supportive of what we're doing. It supports our proposal to a degree. We could go through the three criteria, but in overall,
let's have a look.
Principle
let's
term,
have a look at them.
Supportive.
The first of the criteria is about being located adjoining in close proximity to a settlement which offers a range of services, facilities, good accessibilities. That's the first of them. And do you understand there to be any difference between the appellant and the local authority on that one?
No.
Okay, so if we can sort of put a notional tick next to that one. What about the other two? What were the third is about identified need unlikely to be met in built up area, which brings in the idea of need and also the idea to a degree of alternative sites. I will ask you about that in a moment. Part of that, the whole, I've got a few questions for you on what you've heard about alternative sites. The second is about harm to the character or setting of a settlement or harm to the surrounding countryside. And this is where I just wanted to ask for your reflections on that criterion, together with the similar one that we've seen in Growth 2 about significant adverse impact on the character of the countryside. Do you remember this came up yesterday in the Landscape Roundtable, and the inspector, I think, raised a question about, you know, is this sort of, paraphrase, but is this sort of policy suggesting that no landscape harm at all, if you like, is the appropriate bar or the policy test that we need to be thinking about? And if so, how does that fit together with the NPPF and the rest of it? So Assuming that we get into House 6, assuming that the inspector goes with Miss James and starts thinking, right, our scheme falls within what House 6 is talking about, I need to consider these 3 criteria. I turn to the second one. What do you say is the correct approach to the meaning of that second bullet point?
Yes, I mean, I've been pondering this for some time, not as long as others here, but for some time. So that phrase, the proposal would not cause harm, and you have to put that policy in its setting, in its what it's doing. So it is talking purely about sites outside the boundary, purely outside the boundary. So it seems almost inconceivable to me that you can have an extension outside the development limits without causing at least some degree of harm. That harm might be very, very small, but the way to read this policy is that very small degree of harm would be contrary to that criteria. And we're talking about character or setting of the settlement or the surrounding countryside. So it seems a very absolutist policy in a test which seems almost impossible to comply with. I think those are my views. And again, can I just point out as well,
sure,
that is a significantly, I mean, it's arguably a much higher test than the test which is in GROW 2.
Now let me ask you this: if it were read in that way, if it were read as this sort of almost no harm at all, if sort of blanket no harm policy, if it were read in that way, in your view, how would that sit with the approach that's taken in national policy in the framework?
Well, I think it goes to. I think there are policies which are very absolutist to a very high degree, and say that it's exceptional to build in AONB and designations valued landscapes. And I'm just trying to find the thing that might help us, because I think I'd like to speak to it. 2 seconds. Is it 174?
174.
In the
okay.
MPP.
So let's just get the document before us then. So it's Core Doc 4.1, the MPPF. Section 15 is on conserving and enhancing the natural environment, which starts on page 50. And we've got at 174, which is the paragraph that you're taking us to. We've got we're told at A of that paragraph, we're told to protect and to enhance valued landscapes. And then at B, we're told to recognise the intrinsic character and beauty of the countryside. And then later on in the section, we're told about what we do in national parks and what we do in AONBs and that sort of landscape further down. So what are your reflections on how an absolutist reading, if you like, of House 6 second bullet would sit alongside this kind of approach in the MPPF?
Well, I think it's contrary to it. I think that absolutist thing is right in some locations in the valued landscapes designated because they're exceptional beauty and their special landscape and character issues and qualities. But to me, so there's a difference between, the difference I'm trying to make, sir, is there's a difference between protection and recognizing the character and taking that into account in a decision.
Right.
Whereas this policy is doing something by that wording on its own, and where it said would not cause harm, it is elevating it into something to do with valued landscapes. Thank you.
Let's have a look back just one more time at House 6 then, with all of that in our minds. House 6, page 51, page 50, then over to 51 of the local plan. Second bullet, proposal would not cause harm. So just pausing there, as you've said, not cause harm. Second bullet, that language, not cause harm, seems on the face of it, as you've explained, to be sort of, you know, unqualified, no harm. And you've given your view on how that sits with the NPPF's approach. But not cause harm to what? Not cause harm to the character or setting of a settlement, not cause harm to the surrounding countryside. Now, given what you heard yesterday from the Landscape Roundtable, even on the common ground in the Landscape Roundtable, so not getting into areas of dispute, if you like, and there are obviously some left where there wasn't agreement. Even on the basis of all the common ground that you heard yesterday, are there allegations here of harm to the setting of Bottisham as a whole? Are there allegations to harm to the character of the wider countryside as a whole?
No, based on that evidence I heard and the high level of agreement between each other, the answer to that question is no. There's no wider harm to the outside of that definition within there. Thank you.
Right. Now, that takes us to this third bullet then, where we have an identified need, and at least so far as the local authority is concerned, that much of the policy is common ground. You know, there's agreement on the identified need and that it's acute. And that takes to the final bit of the third bullet, which is about unlikely to be met within the built-up area. Do you see where I'm at?
Yes.
And you'll remember Miss James's evidence, or I suppose it was perhaps her aspiration would be the best way of putting it. That's her word, that the need would be likely to be met within the built-up area. Do you recall that line of the evidence in the cross-examination?
Yes, I did. The wording about it. It was an aspiration. Yes.
So okay, so that this is where this alternative sites idea kind of gets brought in, and you've heard all the evidence on all of that. Could I have please your reflections then for the inspector, as someone who's sort of been around the block in this industry, in this field, on the state of play, the state of the evidence before him in respect of alternative sites?
Could I can I just say, of course, that sir, that the word unlikely in that policy seems to, in that criteria, seems like a very low bar to me in terms of if you place it into a hierarchy of you know, as opposed to it will be met, cannot be met. Unlikely is a very unusual, low-level word. And one more point, sir, is it talks about within the built-up area. So that's a question mark in itself. You know, does it mean any built-up area anywhere in the district, or does it just mean Bottisham? And I'm saying this with knowledge that there are other policies which impact on this, but again, there's a lack of precision there in the language. I mean, the reading of it is it's within this built-up area, and which is bizarre. So if I move on to talk about alternative sites, and only in my experience, I'm not disputing Mr. Belcher's evidence or arguing with it or the things that were agreed, but again, I think it's relevant what this application is for. It is a residential, it is a retirement care village. That is stated in the title. That's quite obviously what it is. And if you would allow me to say some things about the different types of extra care accommodation. There's only really two types, which is I've heard discussed. You know, you have these urban sites, the McCarthy and Stone, Churchill, and other types of sites. And again, usually between 50 and 60 units. And again, I could get into facilities, but that's services, but that's the wrong place to do it. But I just wanted to be absolutely clear, which is straying into other areas, that many village operators, or those who aspire to be village operators, this is the sort of site they're looking for. They're looking for volume so they can achieve economies of scale, and they want space and light, which is more important than ever nowadays, and the quantum of units, the number of units, is relevant to the communal space they can build, the people they employ, and the services. Again, economies of scale, as I said. So I know I'm straying a little bit from what you've asked, but it becomes relevant to the question of alternative sites and what alternative sites. And the reason I'm talking about that is we're getting into the size issues about that Mr. Belcher has used, the hectareage that he's used. And you might ask me, others might ask me something later about that, but it seems very obvious to me that that sort of size of area certainly couldn't be met within the development limits of Bottisham, and from what I've seen from the evidence, wouldn't be met inside any other development limits. So I might have strayed a little bit and gone a little bit further.
Not at all.
I thought it was important to mention that and just say that what's here and what is proposed and what this developer is seeking to supply to the care industry is a very different beast from the urban 50, 60, 70 unit extra care scheme. Having said that, there are exceptions. You will get care villages within town centres, urban areas. They tend to be they tend to be disused schools and hospitals, you know, so they've got quite a quantum of development at a larger level, and they've got green space around them. I was involved in one at the chocolate factory in Keynsham. I'm in Bristol, and of course that was a conversion essentially. So it had lots and lots of green space as part of a wider development. In Westbury Fields in Bristol, that was an old hospital. So you do get them in urban areas with the larger quantums, and there will be outliers as well. But the need for open space in a very pleasant location. I'll go on all day, Mr. Simons, but I'll leave it there.
Let me just put it to you like this then. You've heard about the criteria that we used in the ASA here. As the inspector said earlier on today, our inspector will have to form his own view on whether those are robust criteria. I think particularly the ones that Mr. Smythe was asking about in the cross-examination were the ones about site size, 3.5 to 7.5 hectares, and sort of time scale for delivery, if you like, i.e. by 2025, within 3 years. I mean, you weren't involved because you just joined the team in the last week and a half. So coming to it fresh, if you like, and casting an eye over the work that's been done, what's your view to the inspector as a member of ARCO and all the rest of it on the appropriateness or not of the criteria that have been used?
I think they are appropriate. I think they're appropriate, and that's supported by the letters and documents from Rangeford and from Inspired Villages in Mr. Belcher's evidence, and it's my experience as well, which is relevant here. There are developers looking for all sorts of different types of opportunities, but this is an absolute stereotype site in terms of the space and size that they are looking for, and the level of development to support the financial model. So it is. I'm absolutely convinced this is the thing that I hear from developers every week, that this is the sort of site that they bring to me and ask me to look at. This is the sort of site they want. But that's not to say there aren't other operators who are after the urban sites, who are in a heck of a dogfight with them. Small to medium-sized builders and even larger builders at times, and they have different models. And again, without trying to expand it too much, that comes into the issue about choice, I think, and choice for older people. And maybe when we talk about the PPG and the paragraph about critical, I could expand on that. Thank you.
Absolutely, the importance of choice. Okay, well, I'll ask you when we get to the PPG to expand on the importance of choice. Okay, so taking a step back taking a step back and sort of surveying the terrain on this question of alternative sites, you've heard all of the evidence, as I say, the inspectors heard it all too. We know what the policy test is, at least so far as House 6 is concerned, likelihood of being met within, likelihood of need being met within the built up area. We know what Ms James's position is, which is that, or aspiration is, which is that need is likely to be met within the built up area. Give us your view as a planner then, reviewing the evidence that you've heard. What's your view as the extent to which the inspector could find that the need that we all agree on is likely to be met within the built up area?
I think it just will not happen. I mean, I think it will not happen within the built up area. It will not happen. And I think Mr. Belcher's evidence and the criteria is used and the methodology is correct.
Okay, right. Let's
Sorry,
move.
can I add something else? I do apologise.
You certainly can.
Very slow. Yeah. And of course, we know that already from the evidence of delivery. We know that already. I'm sorry, Inspector, to interrupt my colleague, but I think that's an important point to remember that we are 5, 6, nearly 7 years into this plan. And there's been no delivery of extra care accommodation of any kind within development limits. So I think that is relevant to your considerations, respectfully, sir. I apologize.
What about the idea? No, don't apologise, please. What about the idea that what if there was a site, or even 2 sites, or 3 sites, which had emerged as a consequence of the ASA, and that had met all of the criteria, several sites. Given the sort of acute level of need that we agree on with the council, what do we know about, how whether or not a single site's going to meet all that need, whether or not you'll need more, or somewhere in between?
Well, we need, looking at it, and in terms of the population continuing to age, we probably need 2 or 3 villages of this size or slightly smaller, and 3 or 4 urban type sites of the typical model that are in urban areas. So we need more of this type of development to meet the need that exists now and which is being created in the future.
Okay, right. Thank you very much. So that's all I wanted to ask you about so far as the local plan policies go, which is to say we've had a look at growth 1, growth 2, how 1, how 6. Overall view then, please, on is this plan for the inspector to record, is it your view that this is a plan which is up to date or out of date?
It's not up to date and it's out of date.
And why is that?
In terms of the housing need policies, forgive me, I'm just going to get to Mr. Warner's proof. And he says, so no, that's my answer to that question. Thank you.
Okay. And
in terms of housing calculations and housing needs, I agree with what was said in the April 2020 document in the local plan review. So it's out of date.
But how about this point that has been made repeatedly by Ms James, by Mr Smythe, that this is a council which claims a 5-year supply of deliverable housing sites? Now, how about that? They say, we're doing what we need to do, essentially.
Well, I think my interpretation is that we're not doing what we need to do. It's not doing what it needs to do using the new methodology within the NPPF, the PPG, in terms of addressing housing needs. So I respect that they have a 5-year land supply, but there are issues about that in terms of, the final number it's seeking to reach. And then I could go on and say that while national policy, etc., doesn't have a 5-year land supply for specialist accommodation, I think that is relevant as well, sir. I think that comes into the equation when you consider the plans out of date. So it's certainly out of date in my mind in terms of performance and delivery and potential future delivery and performance on specialist accommodation.
On
given
that
that we,
point you
sorry.
just made,
No, please, Inspector. Sorry.
that methodology point you just made, because I understand that a bit better, please.
I beg your pardon?
You referred to methodology in the PPG, and I'd like to understand more precisely what you mean by that.
Okay, give me 2 seconds, and I will get up the document. CD 4.6.
CD 4.6. That is the. So you're taking us to the local plan review, are you?
I am, and if I look at paragraph 3.9 over onwards, and 311 is saying that authorities' housing need is calculated and has been altered significantly since April 2015. Rather than relying on objectively assessed need from a variety of independent sources, government has introduced a new local housing need method, which incorporates a standard methodology for each local authority's housing need. So again, I think we've had the various documents published since then at national level. So again, 3.16, the new national method has also continued to be updated regularly, which is not accounted for in the 2015 plan. And again, that's the best explanation I think I can give about the methodology, Inspector.
For that, Mr. Snedden, my reading of that is that's why the local plan numbers aren't right, but the 5-year housing land supply was calculated much more recently using the updated methodology. So it's my impression that the 5-year housing land supply figure is
right
as a methodology, or have I got that wrong?
No, I think that must be right. I mean, I know there's a dispute in another appeal about whether or not it is 5 years or not. That's not at all for our appeal, because we've accepted for the purposes of this appeal that there is a 5-year supply on the basis of local housing need. So I think that is right. I think the question, though, that maybe it's my question was unclear. I was asking Mr. Snedden to comment on the up-to-dateness of the plan, if you like, rather than the 5-year housing land supply. That's right.
That's fine, I understand. Yeah.
Let me ask you this then, Mr. Snedden. I mean, in some ways, does it really matter? So put it like this: the 5-year housing land supply, a metric to establish whether or not there is or isn't a 5-year supply of deliverable housing sites over the next 5 years. In this case, we are proposing a specialist form of housing and indeed affordable housing too, both of which the council accepts are subject to an acute need within East Cam. So given all of that background, where the inspector's at, how much does 5-year housing land supply matter or not matter in a case like ours?
In terms of that measure, given the non-delivery, a common ground between the parties, it has a low level of significance in terms of delivering specialist housing when we look at the PPG in the section about critical.
Okay, let's turn to just briefly then away from specialist housing and on to, if we can go straight to affordable housing, if that's all right. And just very in brief summary, could you give the inspector your assessment of the position so far as affordable housing is concerned, and the approach that you ask him to take in respect of this scheme's delivery of affordable homes?
Well, I'm asking Inspector, sir, for you to give the delivery of that housing substantial weight. Again, given some of the things I heard during the inquiry and the figures we went to in the AMR in particular, and the level of affordable housing, I think it verges on very substantial. There's been a constant failure to deliver the affordable housing required and needed. And and again, I would say to you, again, I can go on and explain why affordable housing is important. But I think we all know that it affects people's lives, it affects the community, and the national crisis on affordability. And this is a high value area. So it affects the social order, social interactions, and so forth. You know, so I think the evidence you've heard already, which Mr. Simons could take me to and we could look at, is an exceptional standard of failure and failure to deliver, and there seems to be little prospect of that being resolved in the near future, which is also relevant, respectfully, to your consideration. So I think this, Inspector, you should give it the very highest weight that you can, respectfully.
Could I ask for your that's your view, okay, you know, that you've explained it. Could I ask for your reflections on the council's approach to the weighing up of affordable housing from Miss James? Do you recall she had in her proof it was sort of substantial but tempered, and then I think on the stand it moved to limited and moderate, maybe between the two. I'm not sure where in the end it ended up, but could you give your view on what you heard her say?
Well, I agree with the proof that it's substantial, but I would, as I've just explained, I think you could even move that up into very, or in the very, very highest level of weight in favour. So it makes little sense. But I mean, at one time, I believe, as I made my notes, the view was changed to limited, and then it was changed to moderate. That makes no sense to me. Makes no sense to me at all. And again, one of our other specialists is affordable housing. And again, I look at the other appeals that I see on affordable housing, and it cannot be right, in my view, professional view, that limited or moderate is the correct standard to be applying purely on this issue of the delivery of affordable housing and meeting the needs of this community. It cannot be the right level of weight to apply. Those are my thoughts.
Okay, thank you. Right, I'd like to just touch on some of the other things that you put into your planning scales, if you like, your overall balance. You touched on affordable housing. Could we pick up just some of the others so the inspector gets a flavour for what you're asking him to do, if you like, in respect of each of them? It might be useful to have as a sort of crib sheet for you. Let me just get up the right paragraph. It's paragraph 6.131 of Mr. Warner's proof of evidence. So let's just get that up. I mean, he does it in a number of places, but if you get up Mr. Warner's proof of evidence, page 50, he draws it all together, a paragraph. Let me just get the inspector get there as well, 6.131. Do you have that, Mr. Snedden?
I have that, thank you.
Good. All right. If you've got that, and if the inspector's got it as well, yeah. Good. Thank you. Now, could you've touched on affordable, which is the 1, 2, 3, fourth one down on the list. Could I ask for your reflections on well, the others, really, on any of the others that you'd like to say something to the inspector about? If there's any points of difference between you and Mr. Warner on them, obviously let us know.
Yeah, I'm not Mr. Warner, obviously. And, you know, we would attach slightly different weight to things. And I think on some of these, given the things I've heard during the inquiry, I might have pushed these up, not by huge amounts or massive changes, but I think I would have moved some of these slightly upwards. I think
talk us through that, please.
I will do. So the first one, the need for older persons housing, and again, Ian has used the phrase older persons housing, so and not specialised housing as per the PPG. But there's an argument that both apply, given the things I've said to you about the housing mix policy. Mm-hmm. that both of them are relevant, but certainly in terms of the delivery of specialist housing, taking into account that the exception policy in House 6, there's no evidence that it's actually, delivered anything in these 6 or 7 years outside or outside development limits. So I would push that, given what the PPG is talking about, in the need that there are a range and a whole different sectors of older people. They all have their individual needs and individualization of care and their requirements, and they should be offered choice. They should be offered alternatives. So I would move that into the substantial category, which is not very different from very significant, but I would have moved that. And I respect Mr. Warner's view, but it's based on the things I've heard in the event as it's moved forward, and particularly the advice from our need consultant, need witness. So I'd move that into substantial. Sorry.
Just to just to pause there. Thank you for that. Before we touch on any of the others, you've referred a few times to the PPG, and you referred to it in particular in that last answer. The PPG's on housing for older and disabled people's core doc 4.3. Could we just, if we put a finger in, if we've got it in written hard copy, or just keep the tab open with this proof of evidence in it, could you just very briefly please turn up the PPG core doc 4.3, and just to sort of help us understand why you say substantial weight should be attributed to the delivery of specialist housing. You've referred a few times to this language critical, which we get in that first sentence, the need to provide housing for older people is critical. And you've referred a few times to, I think it's paragraph 10, which is the paragraph that sets out the sort of range of options that the government encourages in order to meet needs for housing for older people. What is it in this PPG that you say the inspector needs to particularly have regard to, and why, when deciding how much weight to attribute to the delivery of specialist housing?
What I would say, Inspector, and again, I know that you will know a great deal about this and this paragraph and have knowledge of it. But one thing I'd like to point out is that nowhere else in the PPG or the MPPF, to my knowledge, is the phrase critical used. You know, so you have to think that the government, the authors, you know, the critical is one. You know, if you place terms of this type in a hierarchy, I often say that critical is one step below terminal and or exceptional. I mean, it is the highest possible test that you could possibly reach, in my view. And again, being respectful to other inspectors, and you know, I sometimes fear that it's not given the weight and balance that it deserves. And again, I'm being respectful to other inspectors in appeal decisions. It's certainly not being the case in. It's certainly not the case in local authorities. Again, it is such a high level that it's an overarching, overriding type of policy. Yes, there are other policies that impact on it, but when we're just looking at this individual one item in the basket of very special circumstances, it is enormous.
Okay. Thank you very much. And just to sort of get a bang up-to-date example of how inspectors have reflected on this very issue that you're talking about, just put away the PPG. We'll go back in a minute to Mr. Warner's proof, but I'm still just on this issue of weight to be given to the delivery of specialist housing. Could you please turn up this St Albans decision that came out the other day, a decision of Inspector Gilbert Woodridge, just to see what, you know, to see how he approached this issue. It's called document 5.18, and I think the inspector's also given it an inquiry document too. It's the Burston Gardens, 31st of Jan 2022.
I've got the document open. I'm just trying to, if you just give me the section you'd like me to.
Of course. Yes, indeed. If you turn in it, please, to page 10.
Oh.
Let me know when you're there.
It was easier when we all had pieces of paper. I do apologise. Although thinking back, it wasn't. Yes, I'm on page 10.
Okay. Now, this is St Albans, different district, obviously different numbers. So we don't gain much by looking at the numbers. But anyway, numbers are all sort of set out in terms of the existing and future shortfall on pages 10 and 11. Do you see, starting with the heading general and specialist elderly housing needs? Do you see?
Yes, I see that.
Okay. Righto. It's over the page to page 12. Goes into the government's policy aspirations in the white paper, which is something our inspectors heard some things about last week, seeking provision of greatest range of specialist housing, ... recognises growing needs. We get, after all of that stuff, 66 there, do you see? 66, yes. Going through all the numbers there, the inspector ends up giving the benefits relating to general and specialist housing needs very substantial weight in favour of the development. Your reflections on that approach, and it was a different district, but in terms of the issues, the issues of principle, in light of an acute need, what do you see as points of comparability?
Again, I think there's, so stating my view that I think it's very substantial weight in favour. In our district that we're dealing with here, I think it is the need, the disappointing performance of the local plan in providing this type of accommodation, and the likelihood of future delivery of this type of accommodation. So I think these three things are comparable to that decision. But of course, it's very difficult to talk about it comparatively because it's a different set of circumstances, etc.
Very much.
But I agree that yes, very substantial weight was the right weight in that case, and I think it's the right weight in this case with respect, sir.
Right. We can put that decision to one side. I just wanted to, given that it's just come in, make sure the inspectors, seen relevant parts of it anyway, parts that might be relevant to your evidence. Okay, shall we go back then, please, to the proof of evidence of Mr. Warner, which we had out, you might remember at page 50 of his proof of evidence, 50, paragraph 6.131. You touched on, we won't go through each of these bullets because we'd be here all day, but anyway, you touched on the first.
I do apologise. I do apologise, but we went away from the PPG.
Is there more you'd like to say in the PPG?
I would like to come back to that paragraph about the critical, because I think...
Go on, of course.
I do apologise, but I thought if we come back to it later while it was open.
Sure.
Again, the later sentence is relative to the alternative sites and methodology and many other matters. It's the part about offering older people a better choice of accommodation. So we don't need just one type of specialist housing, and we don't need just one type of C3 housing. This is a national overarching policy / practice saying that we need choice. We need choice to suit their changing needs. And again, so I do apologise, Mr. Simons, but I think it's very important to get that across. And again, as that sentence moves on, it says, can help them live independently for longer. So national policy is hugely encouraging of this type of use that we are proposing, which its main purpose is to allow people to live independently from longer, as opposed to care home and nursing home accommodation and the issues. And why is the government saying this? I think the government's saying that in part, and it explains, feel more connected to their community and help reduce costs, because one's personal income, and Inspector, I would also say that we've all got to look after ourselves more in the future. The state is not spending as much on resources. And again, I know that there wasn't evidence of that really submitted, but I think it's a common knowledge thing that the cuts since 2010 or not raising, and so So reduce cost of social care. So the government are recognising that this type of development has the potential to reduce the cost to social care and health systems, which is relevant to other evidence you've seen. So again, choice promoted this particular type of accommodation, asking for different types of accommodation to meet older people's needs. And again, that is why I go back to that sentence, that word about critical. It's explaining why this type of accommodation is critical, why premature or essential occupation of care homes, it is important that alternatives are offered, that we have adaptable C3 housing, we have lifetimes homes housing, and it's also important that we have accommodation that avoids residential or nursing. Residential care homes are more relevant than nursing homes, avoids residential care homes. So that is my speech on that paragraph. Thank you.
Right, so very, very good. Thank you. Okay, so let's put away the PPG for now and just turn back to page 50 of the Mr. Warner's proof of evidence. And again, we won't do all of these. You've done affordable housing already. You've done need for older persons housing, and those are the two I really wanted to cover with you. I would like to just ask you though about, I suppose, numbers 2 and 3, health and wellbeing benefits. And freeing up of underoccupied family housing. Your reflections on those?
Yeah, I mean, I might have pushed the health benefits up to very significant weight, but I think that's a small quibble. I do think it has significant weight, but on the freeing up of underoccupied family housing, and again, I'm respectfully, I've heard things during this inquiry and read documents I've not read before. I think if we could look to move to the document, which she's desperately trying to find, which is the housing needs of specific groups, Cambridgeshire and West Sussex. Which is 4.10, I believe.
That's the GL Hearn document you have in mind. That's the GL Hearn document we looked at a bit last week. Core document 4.10. Where would you like this to go?
To 4.66, if that was possible. Which is on, I will tell you.
4.66 is at the top of page 61.
60. Yes, 4.66 was perhaps the most interesting part of it from me, but the paragraphs before it are also relevant in my view. So if
what do you take away from that?
So again, I think the things that are interesting, if we look at table 16 and we look at East Cambridgeshire, you know, we can see large percentages of under occupation and an increase of 23.3% of under occupation. And again, that is incredibly significant in this district. Incredibly, and again, if I look at 466, you know, 55.8% of homes have at least 2 spare bedrooms, and there's a comparison to the national figures of 54.6 regionally and 57.6 nationally, but again in regional performances it's useful. So I think there's and then 4.67 under occupation is most prominent in South, and then it references East Cambridgeshire 62.1%. So the only reason for taking to that is some length, I apologise, is to explain this, is to say there is a particular issue in this district in terms of the fluidity, the sophistication of the market in terms of getting people into the right sized homes and the most suitable homes for them. That is what this tells me, and the other things I've heard in this inquiry. And right sizing and the potential for residents to right size in the wider community and wider area is a very, very significant thing. And which is why I would look to push that one up into freeing under-occupied family housing, which is good for everyone because a more sophisticated market works better. I would give that substantial weight.
And just for the inspector's reference, there's not much point to know that, but just in case of interest, this issue is touched on at 71 to 72 of the St Albans decision. And I'll leave you to see that why the inspector there gave the same point substantial weight. We can leave the inspector to do that in his own time. Okay, thank you very much. Okay, so we are getting there. I think we've done there are some other benefits as well, and I don't want to go through all of them. I suppose what I will ask you to do just before we leave these, put the benefits aside, if you like, is just a comment, please, on two things. Firstly, the public open space issue and the appropriate weight to be given to the public open space that's on offer. And then secondly, employment creation, because there seemed to be a bit of, I don't know, but perhaps the lack of sort of coming together when I asked Miss James about this, about whether we were talking about temporary construction jobs or other sorts of jobs that might come along with a retirement care village and how we should weigh those. So public open space, please. How should the inspector deal with that in his planning balance? Again,
I have to accept that and I do accept that Mr. Warner is correct on the moderate weight, say that first of all. But I think public open space has become more important, but there does not seem to be, as I understand it, a specific need in this locality. But it's still important. I think recreation and access to the outdoor space, it could be easily pushed by the inspector beyond moderate weight, so any decision maker might choose. But I've really little else to say on it other than to say it will be an enormous public asset to this community in my mind. It will be a highly desirable and great thing that the community will be provided with of significance for generations, that we will have this essentially parkland and quite a substantial area of it. Again, it is an enormous benefit to the community, and I'll leave it at that. And I would like to talk about the employment. Thank you. Well, then please do. That was the second thing. So could you just give us your that's the public open space aspect of the scheme, and then the employment opportunities associated with a scheme like this. Could you give the inspector your evidence on that? Yeah. Again, so this differs. This differs, of course, from general housing, where they're built and the construction jobs matter, and some maintenance jobs and the spending that arrives from the occupiers. This proposal will be an ongoing commercial operation. It will employ people not only directly at the site but outside the site, therapists, visiting speakers, and people providing treatments of different kinds, chiropody. So from how I see it, it is not a localized, small, time-limited operation in terms of generation of employment. It is a long-term commercial operation which will generate economic activity, and people will use the shops, but that would be the same in a standard housing scheme. But it's the employment and that I think is most important in consideration of this. And I wonder if I could take you to MPPF paragraph 81, if that was acceptable, which I wasn't at. So yes, at paragraph 81, planning policies and decisions should help create the conditions in which businesses can invest, expand and adapt. That is fine. But then it's the second sentence, I think, that significant weight should be placed on the need to support economic growth and productivity. I think it's that significant weight placed on productivity. And again, with the ongoing commercial activity and so forth, I would push it up beyond moderate weight to significant, as per that part of paragraph 81. And I should say that there have been different views from inspectors, as is meant to happen, in terms of the amount of weight to establish on this. But my own professional view, jobs are jobs. We're in a place of leveling up now, and I think whatever one thinks about that, but we're in a place now where we should be looking at job creation, any job creation, being significant and high in any consideration of applications of this nature. Thank you.
Okay. Right. So we're getting towards the end of this analysis now, because you've set out, and I won't ask you, I'll leave the other benefits in there to be sort of taken as read, if you like, by the inspector. You've set out your approach to the planning balance. You've told us about what you think are the important benefits, and you've attributed weight to those benefits. We now need to draw together your view on relevant harms, and then overall weigh up the benefits against the harms and work out whether or not one clearly outweighs the other to give us an answer. Now, on harms, we've heard about greenbelt openness yesterday at the round table, the landscape round table, and we went into greenbelt openness. So I'm not going to ask you any detailed questions about that, because you've we've been there. The thing that we didn't do yesterday, however, with the landscape witnesses was to just touch on the greenbelt purposes as distinct from openness. And it's just something I'd just very briefly like your view on. As I say, briefly in respect of each one, just so the inspector can record your take on the greenbelt purposes. The greenbelt purposes we find at page 41 of the MPPF core document 4.1. So if you turn up page 41.
I'm there. Can I just turn to that section, Mr.
Sure.
Sure. Yes, I'm there now on both. Thank you.
Okay, so there are 5 purposes at paragraph 138 of the framework. Are you with me?
I am.
So really what I just want is, in brief, because the inspector's heard everything, I think, about the background to all of these that he now needs to hear. I think he understands, he understands that the full visual context and spatial context and all the rest of it. So let's just go through each of them and tell me relevant or not, and if it's relevant, to what extent is there, harm arising from it.
Okay. Criteria A, to check the unrestricted sprawl of large built-up areas. Just no relevance whatsoever. None at all. Okay. And then, sorry, go ahead.
No, go on.
And then the second one, noting the discussions that were had earlier, this is not a town, this is a village. That is not relevant. Not relevant.
Even if the inspector decides to take a sort of a more sort of expansive view of the meaning of town in that sentence, so he thinks, all right, well, let's say Bottisham, treat it as a town, if you like, treat the other villages around it as towns. What's your view on merger? Is this a site, a scheme if developed, that gives rise to risks of merging of settlements, if you like?
Well, in my view, no. I just looking at the characteristics and the sort of the wider envelope of the built development related to the village, but I'm starting to get into visual issues. No is my answer, due to the characteristics, distance to other settlements, and the characteristics of the development and how it fits in and the built envelope. So no, I can't see that even if we were to consider a town as covering villages, I can't see it has any relevance in this regard to this site.
All right. Next one, safeguarding the countryside from encroachment.
Yeah, I think that does have relevance, and there is a degree of harm to that point, and again, there's a great deal of discussion about the level of harm and what that harm is. Again, I've got my own view, but you've heard from people better qualified than me to discuss that. So that one is applicable in answer to your questions.
Your answer is applicable, and as to the extent of harm arising, you rely on what you heard from Mr. Crawford at the Landscape Roundtable, essentially.
I do.
Okay. Next one, preserve the setting and special character of historic towns.
Again, there's a relevance there, but there's no harm in my view. I think that there is no harm in my view, and I think to start looking at the heritage assessment of what that says. Again, it's closely related to the one above in some extent, but so relevant, but very little harm, if any.
Let's ask, why is it relevant when it's referring to towns, but B isn't relevant?
Yeah, that's a good question. What when you say you think it's relevant, why is that? I mean, when you see historic town, are you reading in Bottisham or are you reading in Cambridge? I mean,
I was taking in Bottisham.
Okay.
So I'm not. Again, I know I could be criticised for saying, "Oh well, you're taking a generic term."
No, it's not that. It's I think what the inspector's asking is, all right, you said that in relation to B, that Bottisham's not a town, basically, but it's a village, and so that was your answer to B, was not engaged. And if that's right, then why do you say that D? What's the situation on D? If when by historic town you're talking about Bottisham, but Bottisham's not a town, why do you say that D's engaged or relevant?
Yeah, I misspoke. I apologise.
No, apologise. Now, what is your view? What's your take on D?
My view, taking that interpretation, is that it's not. It is not relevant. It is not relevant, and I'll be scrambling to find out what Mr. Warner said, as I can't recall. But
we'll find out. Yeah.
I mean that. Having said that, I would be willing to look at an interpretation of that in terms of heritage assets.
So
again, I'm just going to go round in a circle.
No, don't worry. So I mean, let's look at it both ways, just so that we're sort of covered off. But we don't want the inspector to sort of stick his neck out on a sort of question of legal interpretation. Number one, you say, all right, it's a village, not a town, not engaged. But number two, if historic towns were to include villages like Bottisham, is this a scheme, if you like, a scheme which is going to harm Bottisham's character as a settlement, if you like?
No, in my view, and no based on the evidence that I've heard from other parties.
Okay. We've looked at that. Well, we've looked at it one way or the other, if you like, so you can be asked about it each way. We've done A, B, C, and D. So the last one is urban regeneration. So this, and just to remind ourselves, of course, Ms. James alleges harm in respect of each of these, not just C, but A, B, C, D, and E, which is urban regeneration. Will there be harm, in your view, if the inspector allows our scheme, which will flow from discouraging the recycling of derelict urban land?
This proposal will have no impact of any kind in the circumstances we see here. It will have no impact on that.
Okay, just to expand a little bit on why you say that.
Well, again, urban again, whether this area, this application is approved and built or not, I think the process of urban regeneration will carry on in the recycling of derelict land. And if it did have any impact, it would be a tiny proportion. And I know might start to talk about incremental impacts of various approvals, but this proposal in terms of it being built or not built, I just do not see, given and again, I'm tempering it to a degree, I don't see this having any significant impact in terms of that particular purpose.
Well, let's put it this way. Let's look at it through this lens. Is there a particular sort of bit of urban regeneration or a particular urban scheme that the council is saying won't come forward, or might be prejudiced or risked or whatever if the inspector allows this scheme?
I've seen no evidence of that, and I've heard no evidence of that.
All right.
Yeah.
So we've done greenbelt purposes. Greenbelt openness was yesterday, and as I understand it, I should ask though, to what extent do you rely on Mr. Crawford for all the things he said about greenbelt openness and all the other things, landscape and visual?
I agree with what he says. I think it was a very, very robust assessment and a very good discussion between the parties. So I agree with his conclusions, and I defer to his opinions, and I don't seek to disagree with them in any way. So I agree with him. I think.
Before we move on, sorry, Mr. Simons.
Of course, no, not at all.
138C.
138C.
To assist in safeguarding the countryside from encroachment. To what degree do you, Mr. Stedden, view this as a policy about character and appearance versus openness? I'm concentrating on that word encroachment there. And I'm just interested in your thoughts on that, please.
With the idea being, of course, encroachment suggests that you could encroach as a sort of spatial idea. If you could put something on a field, you're encroaching into it.
Even if it had been agreed that the development was going to enhance the character and appearance of the area, it would still be an encroachment.
Exactly. There'd be an encroachment, a spatial encroachment, if you like. Yeah. Do you get the question, Mr. Stedden?
Yeah, and I've said that policy is relevant, of course, and I've gone on and given a view about harm. So that is why it is relevant, Inspector, because it's talking about protecting the countryside. The purpose of it, we're moving back to why we designate green belts, is to protect them and keep them open. So again, it is about safeguarding it and seeking to, and we could go back to 148 and not developing it unless there are very special circumstances. But again, I'm expanding on that. Mm-hmm. So that is why the policy is relevant, because its intention is to safeguard any development taking place outside the development limits, and then we end up out in the countryside, and then that moves us on to looking at criteria and tests.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm just checking. As on that, I won't ask the witness to take it up, but just that you might find some assistance, sir, on that question about this purpose. But I'll just give you a reference, and you can take it away yourself. And it's core document 5.4, which is the appeal decision of Inspector Krista Masters in Colney Heath. And that purpose, she says some things about in the context of that case, from paragraphs 24 to 26. I'll just leave you to have a look. Okay, right. So, taking all of that together, then we've done your benefits, we've done the greenbelt issues, you adopt what was said yesterday about character and appearance and greenbelt openness. Strike the balance, then, please. Turn to back to the key test at the second sentence of para 148, and tell us your view on the benefits weighed against the harms, and how the inspector should, if you like, strike that balance overall.
Yes, I'm there. I'm at that paragraph. again, Inspector, I think Mr. Warner and I agree, sir, that in this particular case, in this particular site, with the set of characteristics and the policy test, not unsurprisingly, you would believe that we do believe that the very special circumstances exist. And in my view, they clearly exist based on the points that we can take from these other appeal decisions and from reading the NPPF and all the other criteria of the particular characteristics we've spoken about, downsizing, the local plan delivery rates, the need. Very special circumstances very clearly exist in my view. And then if I take that further and we take the balance on the harm side, I do not see harm in terms of heritage, which we might have discussed in terms of less than substantial harm. I do not see harm in terms of impact on the countryside based on the evidence that I've said, and most importantly, perhaps, harm to openness. So in my view, in terms of that basket which we spoke about at the beginning, the harm versus the very special circumstances which I say exist, I think respectfully, it clearly comes out that the application is, that test is met and in favour of the application. Thank you.
Okay. And we should say, I suppose, for completeness, as part of your analysis, you mentioned heritage impacts there. You have, as I sort of infer, and I think it's common ground with the council, so we can just sort of tick it off, but the inspector needs to be clear on it. You do undertake, as part of your analysis, a balancing of less than substantial harm against public benefits for heritage purposes, and you decide that balance tilts in favour of the scheme, and so you move on to consider very special circumstances. Is that right?
I agree. I read the heritage reports, very interesting document about the history of Bottisham and the area. And again, I quite agree that with the conclusion that and I believe the council does to a degree, that it's less than substantial harm to Bottisham House and the Bottisham Conservation Area, both defined as heritage assets by the NPPF. And again, I think it's also important to point out that it might help the public to a degree as well, that you know, oh, sorry, no, in terms of substantial harm is one thing and less than substantial harm is a very wide church. It's a very wide term. And I noticed in that appeal that was allowed, the inspector took that into account. He applied that sort of criteria that less than substantial, you can have a high level of less than substantial harm, and then you can have a low level or a moderate level of less than substantial harm. And I think what this evidence is saying, having read it through, it's very much at the lower end, the lower end of the less than substantial wide category.
Okay. Can I cover one point there? So, Mr. Simons, you just said there's the paragraph 202 heritage balance, which is less than versus public benefits.
That's right. So yeah, yeah.
And then you just, I think you seem to imply that there's almost like a sequential approach. So if I thought that went in favour of the proposal, then I move on to very special circumstances.
Well, I think
it's another way not to still. This needs to be looked at in two ways. So the less substantial harm balance in terms of paragraph 202 is one thing, and separately there still is less than substantial harm and residual harm that needs to be weighed in the balance against in terms of greenbelt as well. That's a question. Should I be doing that?
Yeah, I think, well, my submission to you in the end is going to be that it is a sequential approach, which is to say that we start off. I'm not saying that you totally disregard the heritage issues, but that you deal with it at 202, and if you find that the public benefits outweigh the heritage harm, which is a matter of common ground. Because if you don't find that, then that's game over for the, it's not game over, but then the MPPF would tell you to refuse permission. So we've got to get through that as almost a preliminary threshold test.
Yeah.
But then in the round, certainly I say that you weigh all the benefits and the harms in your overall VSC balance. I don't think there'd be any basis for, say, excluding low level, less than substantial heritage harms from the VSC balance, just because you've already looked at them earlier on.
Yeah.
Because I think the VSC, I think the whole point that Mr. Snedden's been sort of elucidating on is that, you know, everything goes in, really, all the benefits, all the harms, and it's only if the benefits clearly outweigh the harms that VSCs are demonstrated.
Okay.
So yeah, I think we'd have to do, because I suppose, looked at another way, Inspector, it'd be some of the same public benefits that you'd be bringing to bear in the heritage balance and then the VSC balance. So it wouldn't be fair to have some of the same benefits, but not, you know, but to sort of leave some of the harms behind. So does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Not at all. Now, Mr. Snedden, I was going to ask you a little bit about healthcare contributions, but I'm not anymore, because in the last 20 minutes or something while you've been on the stand, the CCG have sent us all a letter. So I'm gonna, instead of asking you any questions about a letter that you won't have read, I'll draw stumps there and we'll read the letter and we'll come back to it, you know, in the 106 session or whatever it is later on in the week, or maybe this afternoon. But I will, I suppose, just ask you this, Mr. Snedden, if I can. Are you looking for Mr. Snedden?
Sorry, I beg your pardon. I was trying to look at the CCG letter, which
I don't want you to. I don't want you to.
I'll close it. I'll close it.
No, I don't want you to look at it while you're on the stand.
So interesting.
Okay. No, and we'll look at it. We'll look at it together later on, and we'll come back to the inspector once we've all read it. I've not read it yet. Question is, just as a sort of general proposition, try and help the inspector give a flavour. I mean, you tell us you've been involved in lots of similar schemes. So how normal is it, in your view, for retirement care villages like this to sort of generate the need for a 106 contribution towards local GP services?
I mean, I went through the ones in the their core documents. There was only one that required a contribution. Contribution is £73,000, which I believe was operational costs. So it was only one. But in answer to your question, in the wider situation, I was involved in one that involved the building of a GP practice within its grounds, but that was beneficial to the charitable applicants, developers. So my simple answer is, I think it is very, very rare in my experience that I've seen requirements, because we were always making this argument that it's actually beneficial to the local community. It's beneficial because we're saving, and that's in a private individual sense and a community sense, because of all the things that were raised by Mr. Sedgwick. It's very rare. That was far too long an answer. I apologize.
No problem. No, that's fine. And as I say, almost put a pin in that thought, because we'll see what the CCG are now telling us. It's a shame it's come as I draw to an end of the planning evidence. But anyway, we'll see what they're telling us, and we'll come back to the inquiry, you know, this afternoon or later on in the inquiry, and see what we've got to say about it. Okay, Mr. Snedden, thank you very much, sir. Those are the questions for Mr. Snedden in chief.
Okay, thank you very much. And this seems like appropriate time to take a break. So I suggest we take, it's 11:35, so we take 20 minutes and come back at 11:55. Is that okay with everybody?
Am I in purdah, Inspector?
No, because you haven't started cross-examination yet.
Okay, I just want to be absolutely certain.
Okay, all right, thank you. So the inquiry is adjourned, and we'll resume at 11:55. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. John, you'll want to switch off your microphone and video.
Yeah, I'm just doing that now.
Welcome back, everybody. The time is 11:55 and the inquiry is resumed. Now, obviously, we had the letter that's come through. Mr. Simons, I don't know, I know it's a very short break. I don't know if you've had time just to very briefly look at it and work out how you want to approach dealing with it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the best way forward it will be to discuss it at the 106 session whenever we get there. I guess that'll be on Friday, isn't it? That's the idea. We do that on Friday. We're happy to discuss that on Friday. It might be, we'll have a proper discussion with you, sir, then, and we can discuss whether or not what, if any, changes might be required to the draft 106.
Okay, thank you. You okay with that, Mr. Smythe?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Thank you. In that case, then unless there's anything else, I'm happy to turn over to cross-examination.
Thank you. Mr. Snedden, you've explained that you've got a particular expertise and experience in this area, and this particular breed of residential development. Can you give the inspector an idea as to how many of these retirement villages there are in England?
Yes, I can, and it's not an easy question to answer. So the Association of Retirement Communities, of which we're an affiliate and represents the vast majority of care village operators, has 182 villages, is the figure I deduced. But I think that the figure is actually higher than that because there's a difficulty in terminology. But I think the true figure is something approaching something like 300, and I'm excluding the urban extra care type developments, and I'm aware that different figures, but that's my opinion, Mr. Smythe.
Thank you. How did the appellant come to select this site for the proposed development?
I don't know, Inspector.
Was any formal site selection assessment undertaken?
I've no evidence of that, Inspector.
Is there a good reason why the alternative site assessment wasn't provided at application stage?
I have no reason to know that, Inspector. I just don't have knowledge to answer that question.
Did you hear Mr. Belcher's evidence on Friday?
I did.
He told the inquiry that in the majority of cases to which he has been involved, which I take to mean 3 out of the 4 cases, the alternative site assessment was submitted at application stage. Do you remember hearing that evidence?
I did.
And do you remember Mr. Belcher told the inquiry that in respect of the Stapleford decision, which is 8 miles away, same bit of green belt, the alternative site assessment was submitted at application stage?
Yes, I'm aware of that.
I raised it in opening on Tuesday at 10:45 or so. So you've had 8 days, or since you were appointed, 7 days. Have you thought to ask your client why the alternative site assessment wasn't submitted earlier?
Yes, I did ask that question. I think there are 2 parts to that question. One, it wasn't requested by the council, and I know that's disputed, during the course of the application, and they've confirmed to me that they've had nothing in writing from the council, but I know there's a dispute between them about what was said in various meetings. So that is the first part of the question. The second answer is they did not believe it was necessary, based on, in part, that first reason, and secondly, the evidence they found of delivery and the availability of sites in the area and the need in the area. So they did not feel it was required in this set of circumstances.
Can we take up the planning statement, please? Call document 1.13.
Yes, I have that.
So if we turn to internal page 31,
Yes, I have that.
Section 7.1, we've got the principle of development. The planning statement refers to growth 2.
Yes.
Then in paragraph 3, it refers to policy HOU 6. The third bullet point, there's an identified need for such provision that is unlikely to be met within the built up area. Do you see that?
Yes.
And then if we turn over the page to paragraph page 32.
Yes, I have that.
About 4 paragraphs down, overall, Bottisham is considered to be a sustainable location. There is an identified need for proposed development that is unlikely to be met in the defined development envelope. The proposed development must meet the criteria, exceptional criteria of growth 2 and HOU 6, and the site is considered a suitable and sustainable location for the proposed development.
Yes.
You see that? So you've just told the inquiry that there was evidence of deliverability. What do you mean by that, and how did that satisfy the applicant that it was unlikely that the development could be provided inside the built settlements?
Well, I think this site, that there was a willing landowner, there was availability in terms of the criteria. But you're asking me about the impact of that decision within the development limits of Bottisham?
No, I'm asking you why an alternative site assessment wasn't provided at application stage. And when I pressed you, you said, firstly, it wasn't requested by the council. And secondly, you seem to indicate that there was effectively an informal assessment done because you had evidence on deliverability and need, which satisfied the then applicant that that part of the policy was satisfied.
What I meant by that, or what I do mean by that, is that they would have carried out an assessment identifying that they wanted to be in this area. So at a high level, they wanted to be within this area, and that is based on the need, the lack of current supply, and they looked for a site. Now, I don't know if that was a formal document or an informal document. I just don't know the answer, but they have looked at the market, the need in the area, and they're aware of the criteria that are required on the size of site. And availability becomes an issue for them. So, and again, I think in terms of within the development limits, because we were talking about Bottisham, that it seems obvious to me, and I think everyone, that there's no size of site within Bottisham approaching this level.
Is there a good reason why the appellant didn't make contact with the council prior to completing the alternative site assessment?
I think, is there a good reason? I'm not aware of one, but I think there's an explanation as to why they didn't.
I think Mr. Belcher's explanation was there's no requirement to, and therefore he didn't because it's not his practice. That was, I hope, a fair summary of his explanation. Have you got anything to add to that?
That Mr. Belcher is an experienced person at doing these sites assessments, appeared before inspectors. He's well aware of the requirements that are required. We had statements in the council's evidence that they had that witness in particular had little experience of the sector and how it works, what the requirements are. So to me, that decision that was made not to contact the council was justified because he is an experienced professional applying a set of criteria which have been used and he's used to doing and carrying out that survey based on his knowledge and the client's knowledge of what different operators want.
Can we take up Mr. Warner's proof, page 21?
I'm there, Mr. Smythe.
Great. At the bottom of page 21, we've got a chart where Mr. Warner summarises what weight he thinks should be given to particular policies of the local plan. Do you agree with the chart?
I agree with that.
And over the page, we've got a summary on page 22 as to whether there is conflict or not. And Mr. Warner's view is that the only policy where there is some conflict is growth 2. Do you see that?
Yes, I do.
And do you agree with that?
I do.
Okay. And then paragraph 4.99, Mr. Warner says, I've considered the majority of the relevant development plan are capable of being afforded full weight. I've concluded that the most important policies for the determination of this appeal are not out of date, and that the overall basket is similarly not out of date. Do you see that?
Yes.
And do you agree or disagree with that paragraph?
I agree.
So I understood in your evidence in chief that you thought that the local plan was out of date in respect of those policies which touch on housing need.
Yeah, I made a mistake. I apologize. Yeah, I apologize. I made a mistake.
No, don't worry. Okay, yeah, understand.
So just to clarify, are you now retracting your statement from earlier on, Mr. Snedden, or are you saying that which way round is your mistake?
The plan is not out of date.
Okay, thank you.
Because it's in compliant, and yeah, it's not out of date.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, understood. Can we turn back to the planning statement, which is core document 1.13?
Yes.
Let me know when you're there. It's internal page 30.
Yes.
So we can see, if we look at the bottom under section 6.4, when the planning statement was submitted 2 years ago, it says, given that the district council can only demonstrate a 3.7-year supply of deliverable housing sites, the policies that are most important are considered to be out of date. While the tilted balance of the NPPF does not apply because we're in Greenbelt, the lack of an up-to-date housing policy should nonetheless be a strong material consideration in the determination of the planning application, together with the very special circumstances. Do you see that?
Tell me the paragraph number, because we went over the other.
Sorry, at the bottom, 6.4, page 30.
So I'm going to go to my electronic copy because
Don't worry.
I seem to have an issue with the page numbering, which seems extraordinary. So I'm on page 30.
Of
Yes.
CD 1.13.
Sorry, I didn't hear you, Inspector.
Just checking, you're on the planning statement, CD 113.
Yeah. Sorry, I was looking at Mr. Warner's proof. I do apologise. I thought we'd moved to Mr. Warner's proof. I do apologise. Page 30 of the plan. Yes, I'm with you eventually, and I'm reading it as we speak.
Yeah, I'll give you yeah, if you just read that paragraph to yourself, and let me know when you've had the chance to digest it.
Yeah, I heard you say it, and yeah, you were accurate in what you're saying.
Yeah. So at that time, there was a housing supply shortfall, and now it's agreed that there isn't, or at least the appellant doesn't dispute that the council's meeting their need.
That's correct.
Yeah. And that is a material change of circumstance since the planning statement was written, isn't it?
It is.
And it's capable, I'll put no higher than that, it's capable of altering the overall planning balance.
It has an impact on the planning balance.
Can we then turn to page 31, still in the planning statement?
Yes.
I'm interested in this point that HOU 6 doesn't apply to the appeal site. Because if you look at page 31 under principle of development, the third paragraph down, the planning statement makes reference to HOU 6. Do you see that?
Yes.
And as I think I turned your attention earlier, if we turn to page 32, the fourth paragraph down, beginning overall, the proposed development meets the exception criteria of Grove 2 and policy HOU 6. Do you see that?
You mentioned page 32 of the proof.
Of the planning statement, following page.
Yes, I'm there now on page 32.
Yes, it's the fourth paragraph down, beginning overall.
Yes, I see that. I have that.
So it concludes the proposed development meets the exception criteria of Grove 2 and policy HOU 6. Do you see that?
Yes.
There is no hint or suggestion in the planning statement that HOU 6 doesn't apply because it doesn't cover the type of development proposed.
That is correct. That is the view expressed in that statement.
So do you know when the practice to which you're a member changed its position as to the applicability of HOU 6?
Forgive me if I'm wrong, but we didn't write this planning statement.
Oh, right. That could be a very good answer then. So it's, yes, written by LDA design.
It's LDA design rather than Techno King, I think is the confusion.
Yeah,
is that
a badging issue, or is that a
No, it was an authorship issue.
Was an
As you can, I don't know whether it explains that, but no, it was Techno King were instructed at the appeal stage rather than the application stage.
Okay, thank you.
Fine. So I'm not going to accuse you of inconsistency, Mr. Snedden, but we can certainly see there's a difference of approach, that the previous planning consultants didn't take the point that you've taken, that HOU 6 doesn't apply.
Correct, absolutely. It's expressing a different opinion.
Yeah, understood. And you're perfectly entitled to do so, and I won't take it any further than that. Can we take up HOU 6, which is court document 4.5, I think.
Yes, I have that.
Yeah, and it's internal page 50.
Yes, I'm there.
And as I made a note of your evidence, that you considered the policy was heavily slanted towards residential care homes and nursing homes, that if the policy intended to refer to extra care, it would have been more explicit. And then when Mr. Simons brought your attention to the explanatory text at paragraph 4.73, you made the point that the language in 4.73 wasn't transferred or carried over to the wording of the policy. Do you remember that?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, absolutely.
When one reads, when one tries to interpret policy, that is informed by the explanatory text which accompanies the policy itself, doesn't it?
Yes.
And if one reads paragraph 4.73, it's very obvious, isn't it, that when the policy which is entitled residential care accommodation, that should have a broad meaning. Do you agree?
I don't agree. I don't agree. I think one reinforces the other. You know, the wording of the policy also to a degree informs the text that we're reading. And again, maybe that's not the proper legal assessment, but no, I don't agree if you're asking me to say that residential care accommodation includes extra care under that title. It might well do, but that is not what the policy goes on to discuss in terms of extra care.
We can agree, can't we, that policy should be read not like the terms and conditions of a contract, but should be read with common sense. Do you agree with that general principle?
Yes, yes, I do.
And it's obvious, isn't it, when the policy refers, or it's entitled residential care accommodation, that's shorthand, and it isn't intended to narrowly refer simply to residential care homes, because the explanatory text makes clear that it has a broader meaning. What do you say to that?
I don't agree. I think I don't agree.
Can I suggest to you that your interpretation is implausible, and it requires the inspector to disregard what is said at paragraph 4.73?
I don't know the purpose of paragraph 4.73. It might simply have been, I use the word musings about the nature of the market and the different things that are emerging. So I just do not see that it is implausible, Mr. Smythe, my viewpoint, or Mr. Warner's viewpoint.
Can I deal with that issue about the musings? I don't need to remind you the considerable amount of time and effort which is put into drafting a plan and getting it over the line to adoption, do I?
No.
And the explanatory text which accompanies HOU 6 only covers about 2/3 of the page, doesn't it?
Yes.
It's not really fair, is it, to try and diminish what is said at paragraph 4.73 as musings, when in fact it's the explanatory text which accompanies and helps to inform one's approach to policy HOU 6.
But I think it's helping to set the scene for that particular policy about care accommodation for various groups of people. That's what 4.7.1 does. It's a care accommodation for various groups of people. And so it goes through these different options. And then we have the actual policy, which we have to read in a common sense point of view. So, I mean, I will not disagree there's a difficulty in language, but I think our viewpoint and my viewpoint is a reasonable one, and I do not think it's implausible. You can talk about imprecision of language and imprecision of terms, which is a common thing in the care industry, as was said by others, all the different types of accommodation. Thank you.
Yeah, understood. I think the inspector's probably got the nature of the dispute, so I'll leave it there. The next topic is greenbelt. Miss James estimates in her proof, and she gives her working, that 3% of the district is covered by greenbelt. Is that agreed?
I wouldn't disagree with that.
Yeah. And there are only 3 villages within the greenbelt, being Bottisham, Lode, and Swaff and Bolbec. Is that also agreed?
I have no reason to disbelieve that, and I think it's agreed, and I agree.
And Mrs. James gave evidence on Tuesday last week that her best estimate is that in South Cambridgeshire, about 1/4 of the district is covered in greenbelt. Is that something you agree or disagree?
I believe that's correct. I believe I read it in one of the appeal decisions.
Yeah. So we can agree, can't we, that South Cambridgeshire is more constrained than East Cambridgeshire?
In terms of green belts, yes.
Yeah. There was a review of the green belt which affirmed Bottisham's location within it.
I accept that. I'm sure that's correct. I cannot say I have direct knowledge of that to be correct or incorrect, but I'm sure it is correct. But yeah.
And it forms no part of the appellant's case that the appeal site doesn't perform at least one of the functions expected of Greenbelt.
Yes, I agree.
Yeah. The purposes, can we go back to the planning statement? And it's called document 1.13.
Yes, I'm there.
Thanks. And then it's internal page 36.
Yes, I'm there.
And we've then got the section titled Greenbelt Appraisal and the Greenbelt Purposes. Do you see that?
Yes, I'm there.
And do you see what is said about Purpose 1, the unrestricted sprawl of large built-up areas?
Yes.
And there's no suggestion in the planning statement, I know you didn't author it, but there's no suggestion that Purpose 1 wasn't engaged because Bottisham is a small built-up area rather than a large built-up area.
Give me 2 seconds. I'd just like to turn to the NPPF. Yes, that is correct.
And then in respect of Purpose 2, to prevent neighbouring towns merging into one another. Again, that's the point isn't taken in the planning statement, that because Bottisham's a village, therefore from a strict reading of the framework, Purpose 2 isn't engaged.
Yes, that is what it says.
Simon, I thought I was waiting for you. Are you waiting for me?
I thought I'd answered your question, Mr.
Sorry, no,
Smith.
not at all. No, that's my fault. Don't worry.
In terms of Purpose 1, we were agreed.
Can we just recap where we ended then? Because I'm slightly lost myself as to whether the question was answered.
Yes, so I think I was putting to you that in page 36 of the planning statement, under Purpose 2, the point wasn't taken that because Bottisham's not a town, therefore, strictly speaking, Purpose 2 isn't engaged.
Okay.
I think you agree.
Yeah, I do apologise. Purpose 2, yes, that is what that collection of words says.
And if we take up the appellant's Greenbelt assessment, it's core document 1.11.
Yes, I have that.
I'm just loading mine up now. And it's internal page 14.
Yes, I'm on that page, Mr. Smythe.
Yeah. So if we look at the third paragraph from the bottom, the southwestern corner of the application site is within the village conservation area. The presence of such designation indicating the relationship between historic settlements and the landscape is another component of the wider setting of Cambridge. National Greenbelt Purpose 4, Cambridge Greenbelt Purpose 2. And then the paragraph below that, the majority of the Greenbelt parcel, including the application site, comprises undeveloped farmland and woodland and plays a role in preventing the sprawl of the village eastwards. Do you see that?
Yes.
Yeah. Can we next take up the Stapleford decision at core document 5.18?
Yes, I have that.
And then it is paragraph 7.
Yes, I was there already.
Yeah. I mean, on the point of principle, do you agree with the inspector that it makes no difference which or how many of the purposes of the green belt would be harmed?
Absolutely.
Yeah, okay. ENV 10 is the next one. Can we take up Mr. Warner's proof at page 13?
Yes.
And Mr. Warner articulates a criticism of ENV 10 at paragraphs 4.26 and 4.27. In effect, he draws attention to an alleged inconsistency between ENV 10 and the framework, which he therefore says tempers the weight to be given to ENV 10. Do you see that?
Yes, I see that.
And is that do you agree with that analysis? Do you agree that ENV 10 is materially inconsistent with the framework?
Yes, yes, I do.
Okay. Can we take up ENV 10?
Yes, I'm looking at it now.
Yeah, so I think it's internal page 82.
Yes, I have that.
Yeah, I'm there as well.
Great. So we've got the body of the text at the bottom page 82, and then we've got the explanatory text above it. And you see at paragraph 6.11.4,
Yes.
development proposals which come forward in the green belt will be assessed against the government policy in the framework and other policies in this local plan. Development will be strictly controlled and generally linked to those uses which require a rural setting and preserve the openness of the green belt. The framework sets out clear guidance on the types of building development that may be exceptionally permitted in green belt areas and so on. Do you see that?
Yes.
So the explanatory text explicitly refers to the framework, doesn't it?
It does.
And we know
as does the policy. I do apologise. As does the policy. I apologise for interrupting you.
No, not at all, don't worry. And then we know the local plan was adopted in April 2015. The local plan was adopted about 3 years after the framework was first published.
Yes.
And so again, it's implausible, isn't it, to suggest that ENV 10 is in any way inconsistent with national policy. Because if the inspector were to accept that criticism, it followed that the examination inspector failed to identify an obvious inconsistency.
No, I do not think it's implausible. I think that is a perfectly reasonable opinion for myself and Mr. Warner to have. And if we read this policy in isolation from the very special circumstances arguments in the NPPF, then when it's talking about certain exemptions, I think it's talking about the exemptions listed above. So it is that policy, not including very special circumstances, is relevant, Mr. Smythe, and I don't think it's implausible to reach that opinion that there's a degree of inconsistency because it doesn't recognise the very special circumstances.
So is it your opinion that because the policy doesn't explicitly refer to VSC, that's eloquent of some inconsistency of national policy?
I think it is inconsistent with national policy. To a degree, a small degree, but yes. I think the vast majority is consistent with national policy.
So if the words VSC were included within the body of the policy, that would satisfy you that it was fully consistent with national policy?
To me, yes.
Next topic is heritage. Can we take up the framework? I've got it as a freestanding document. So if you've got it in front of you, do you want me to try and find the?
Yeah, you know, I put this one on one of my numerous screens and didn't save the planet, etc., and didn't print it off.
It's 4.1 if that helps.
Thank you. Thanks.
I've got it. Yeah.
And can we turn to the chapter on heritage, which is starts on page 55.
Yes, I'm there, Mr. Smythe.
Thanks. And then if we turn over the page, we've then got the section on proposals affecting heritage assets.
Yes, I see that.
And then if we look at paragraph 197, in determining applications, or in this case, determining appeals, local authorities should take account of. And if we look at paragraph C, the desirability of new development making a positive contribution to local character and distinctiveness. Do you see that?
Yes.
And then if we look over on page, paragraph 199, when considering the impact of proposed development on the significance of a designated heritage asset, great weight should be given to the asset's conservation, and the more important the asset, the greater the weight should be.
Yes, I see that.
And then finally, paragraph 202, which is the basket we fall in this case, where a development proposal will lead to less than substantial harm to the significance of the asset. This harm should be weighed against the public benefits of the proposal, including where appropriate securing its optimal viable use. Do you see that?
Yes.
Yeah. Can we take up what is the agreed position on heritage, which is core document 2.5, the appellant's heritage assessment. That's core document 2.5.
So I'm in that document, not the statement of common ground.
No, yeah, the heritage, the appellant's heritage assessment.
Okay, I'm on that document now. If you can give me a
great.
print.
So can I just check, sir, if you had the chance to read it, because it's the purpose of this question is more to draw your attention to bits, and if you've read it, then I don't want to.
I have read it, and I paid particular attention to the conclusions because, as I said in my thing, it was they're always interesting, heritage assessments, because you get a sense of the history of the settlement and just generally interesting. So yes, I have read it.
Yeah, and sir, have you managed to read it?
Yes.
Yeah, fine, great. Well, I said it's there to be read, but it's common ground at paragraph 4.25. That there'll be a limited adverse impact on Bottisham Hall, the listed building. Do you see that?
I do.
And then in respect to the conservation area, there's also a limited impact on the conservation area.
Yes.
Yeah. And so in those circumstances, the statutory duty, which in respect to listed buildings and conservation areas, section 66 and 72 are engaged, aren't they?
Yes, they are.
I think, do we just need to be, sorry, I don't want to interrupt you, just on section 72, because we're not within a conservation area. Might we, I mean, there's nothing between us on heritage, of course, but just so the inspector doesn't get the wrong idea. I think so far as the conservation area is concerned, we agree that the NPPF's engaged on conservation areas, but section 72, I think perhaps given that we don't fall within one, or partially with it anyway, I'll leave it with you. I just wanted to draw.
No, so my learned friend was right to pull me up on it. I'm happy with that position. And again, it's common ground that we're in the less than substantial category. It's not a showstopper, and it's not a reason of itself to dismiss the appeal, but it should be added into the negative side of the weighing scales when the inspector comes to do his final planning balance. Do we agree on that?
I agree.
And the presence of the limited harm to the listed building and the conservation area make it more difficult, doesn't it, for the appellant to demonstrate very special circumstances? Because if the harms are that little bit higher, it means the benefits have to be that little bit more potent in order to clearly outweigh. Do you agree?
I think I find it difficult to agree to that, because I spoke at the beginning about the separate baskets, and it's like a scales. Certainly any heritage harm goes in the harm basket on a set of scales. So in that sense, it is something that is recognized by the appellants and myself as being a harm, and it goes in the scale against it.
Yeah, okay. And then we've got, I think this may be the penultimate topic. See how we get on. It's growth 2. Can we take up again Mr. Warner's proof? It's page 21.
Sorry, I was trying to find the policy at the same time, because I do apologise.
Or document 4.5 for the local plan.
I've got my paper copy.
It's internal page 25, growth 2.
Yes, I'm looking at Grove 2, and I'm looking at Mr. Warner's proof at page 21, I believe you said.
So it's common ground that the inspector should give full weight to growth 2.
Yes, that's Mr. Warner's opinion.
And is that also yours?
It is.
Yeah. And Mr. Warner, on page 14,
Yes.
And, paragraph 4.36 says that the conflict with growth 2 is limited at best. Do you see that?
Is that in 4.34? I'm just trying to identify that.
I've got it at 4.36, but he may have said it.
36, I beg your pardon. Yeah.
Now, Grove 2 sets out the locational strategy for the development plan, doesn't it?
It does.
A key purpose of any development plan is to set out the locational strategy for the district. Do you agree?
Yes, but there are many key purposes which all compete with each other on occasions. But yes, I do agree, Mr. Smythe. I really try not to be difficult for you.
No, not at all. I mean, can you think of an objective more important for a development plan other than locational strategy?
Yes, I can. meeting the housing needs of the population, meeting their employment needs. I mean, that's my opinion. I think that is something that's very important. I mean, you could say that the locational plans flow into that and they work between each other. But in my own opinion, and forgive me, and I may be wrong, and you may point to a piece of legislation in the MPPF that says, my professional opinion is that the locational strategy should be tempered by meeting the needs for employment, for housing, and meeting the special needs groups that are identified in the PPG. So yes, I would say that's not to belittle the importance of locational strategy. It's one of the most important, but in my viewpoint, the two work together, and meeting the needs of the population, the region, and the country is very important.
Yeah, and in this local plan, the locational strategy goes to its heart, doesn't it?
Goes to its heart. It is a very important part of the local plan. I'm not sure I particularly like the phrase goes to its heart, but it is a very important part of the local plan.
Yeah, well, I'm happy with that. I don't want to quibble over language. That's very fair, Mr. Snedden. I mean, if the inspector looks at the local plan, I've totted it up. There are 47 main policies, plus the housing allocation policies and the employment allocation policies. But we can agree, can't we, that Growth 2 is one of the most important policies within those large number of policies.
Yes, I've agreed to that. Yes.
And can we take up the Growth 2 and look at the explanatory text on page 23?
Yes.
So we've got a section titled Locational Strategy, and then at the bottom of the page, paragraph 3.3.4. Part of this strategy also involves trying to ensure that as much development as possible takes place within the built-up areas of the market towns and villages, rather than the open countryside. In some cases, new housing will need to take place on the edge or close to settlements, as there are insufficient opportunities in the built-up parts of settlements to meet identified needs. And that goes to the third bullet point of HOU 6, which we discussed earlier. And it goes on to say in that paragraph, development envelopes, this is a few lines down, development envelopes have therefore been drawn around the main built-up areas of market towns and villages in order to prevent sprawl into the open countryside and protect the character and setting of the settlements. Development envelopes provide certainty to local people and developers, and were supported by a high proportion of the community in consultation on the local plan. Do you see that?
Yes, I do.
And then next on following paragraph 3.3.5, development envelopes are shown on the settlement inset maps of the policy maps. And then towards the end, these are considered to be part of the open countryside. I can leave that. And I think paragraph, sorry, a bit slightly bumbling. At bottom of the page, 3.3.7, outside the development envelopes, there will be a strict policy of control over development. However, exceptions may be allowed for certain types of development in the countryside. And that's where HOU 6 comes into play. Do you see that?
It doesn't mention HOU 6, but in a sense, policies like HOU 6 that allow exceptions beyond this, I think it mentions two of them specifically, doesn't it?
Yes, sorry, yes, on page 26, where we've got the exceptions.
Yes, in the policy text.
Yes, the third bullet point.
Yes, but I'll just make the point that you read that paragraph 3.3.7. I'm just making the point, it doesn't specifically reference HOU 6, but it references 2 other policies.
Yeah. And looking at the main body of growth too, I think you used the expression hierarchy. We can see that, I think I've described it as a pyramid, but if you look at the first paragraph, we've got the most sustainable bits of the district where we try and focus development are the 3 market towns of Ely, Soham and Littleport. Do you see that?
Yes.
Then the next row down in the pyramid is limited development to take place in the villages.
Yes.
And then finally, outside the defined settlement envelopes in the 4th paragraph.
Yes.
And then we then got the category of open countryside where the development plan says development should be strictly controlled. Do you see that?
Yes.
Yeah. If the inspector agrees with the council that the appeal engages HOU 6 and offends it, offends growth 2, and accepts Mr. Brown's evidence that it offends ENV 1 and 2.
That's a lot of hypotheticals. I'm lost my not hypotheticals, outcomes. So I do apologise, but I obviously want to be clear and precise in my answer. So,
Yes. In fact, yeah. So it's common ground. Grove 2's offended, and we argue about the difference, and you say limited, and we say significant. But if we proceed on this basis, that HOU 6 applies and is offended, the council wins the landscape argument, and the inspector finds conflict of ENV 1 and ENV 2. In those circumstances, we could agree, can't we? The development plan as a whole would be in conflict with the appeal.
as a whole, but it's so I've never argued that growth 2 is not engaged, but it's tempered, isn't it? It's tempered by the potential silence on extra care accommodation, and it's tempered by other things. But in those particular set of circumstances which you were saying, yes, the inspector is obviously free to find his decision, but I would have to say, I and this appellant and the team have suggested reasons why, not least because the failure of the growth 2 to deliver this type of accommodation, why he should temper any such finding with those characteristics and issues that we've raised, and including the level of landscape harm and impact on openness.
Yeah, understood. Can we take up the framework again? And it's internal page 7.
I'm there, Mr. Smythe.
Yeah, great, thank you. So it's paragraph 12. The presumption in favour of sustainable development does not change the statutory status of the development plan as the starting point for decision making. Where a planning application conflicts with an up-to-date development plan, so that's on my premise, is where we are, because we agree it's an up-to-date plan, not out of date. And if the inspector accepts the council's case in the way I've described, and it would conflict with the development plan. So we're in that category based on those assumptions. Permission should not usually be granted. Local planning authorities may take decisions that depart from an up-to-date development plan, but only if material considerations in a particular case indicate the plan should not be followed. Do you see that?
Yes, absolutely. Yes.
And that's a very strong hint or indication by government that if you've got an up-to-date plan and the proposal conflicts with the up-to-date plan, usually the appeal will be dismissed.
Unless there are material considerations otherwise. And we have a development plan-led system by legislation, but it quite clearly says, but only if material considerations in a particular case indicate otherwise. But yes, I don't disagree with anything you said, Mr. Smythe.
Final question, just one of factual confirmation. Councillor Kane, when I think it was she, forgive me if I've got misgendered her, said on the morning of the second day that there were limited bus services in Bottisham, and there wasn't a bus service on Sunday. As a matter of fact, is that right, or don't you know?
I do not know the answer. I mean, I looked at the statement of common ground. I looked at what the highway officer said, the committee report. I can't recall that particular piece of information. So I can't confirm it one way or another, Inspector.
Right. So would you just give me one moment now, so I turn my back?
Okay. I'm not a Roman emperor.
That's a good one. You're on mute, Mr. Smythe, just so you know.
Yeah. So you're right, it's a pompous court expression.
Yeah, some judges treat themselves a bit like Roman emperors, so that's a problem. You're going to get a bit shirty if you turn your back.
Thank you, Mr. Steddon. That's all the questions I have, sir. Now, yeah, we've done in just under an hour. So that's good.
Thank you so much. Inspector, have you got any questions for Mr. Steddon at all?
Not beyond what I already asked, but I think Dr. Keith indicated that she might.
Yeah, of course she did. Yes.
Turn to her now to see if she does or doesn't, or she's even on the line.
I think she's her sort of box is on the. She's on the line, but whether or not she's actually here or not, I'm not sure. Are you there, Dr. Keith? Are you out there in the ether? I think it met.
I think.
if push up. Sorry, sir. Go, please.
I was going to say, given that we've got a bit of time, it's coming up to 1 o'clock anyway.
Sure.
I think I might prefer to take lunch just to make sure we haven't accidentally cut across Dr. Keith.
Let's do that. Yeah.
And then we can do re-exam after that. Is that okay with you?
Absolutely. At the moment, there's no re-examination right now, but obviously, if you or Dr. Keith have more questions, there might be some. So, but what that does mean, just so that we're absolutely clear, Mr. Snedden, is that if you're going to be on the stand over lunch, Mr. Snedden, so you'll have to sort of isolate yourself, as it were. No communications with the team over lunch. But that's fine, sir, and we can pick up again with Mr. Snedden after lunch.
Okay, thank you. And I think I would like to do conditions this afternoon, at least make a start, and we can always come back to it on Friday if we have to.
Absolutely, sir.
That as well. Okay, 12:55. Shall we resume at 1:45? Is that okay with everybody?
Yes, sir. Absolutely. 1:45.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. The inquiry is adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you.